There is a sound that people have been hearing for a very long time. It rolls in from the west, low and heavy, felt in the chest before it reaches the ears. It moves across open water, across grain fields, across the rooftops of places where people are trying to live their ordinary lives. For a few seconds, everything stops. The farmer sets down his tools. The fisherman looks up from his nets. The mother holds still in the middle of whatever she was doing and listens. Then it passes. Everyone goes back to work. For over 1,000 years, across the northern reaches of Europe, people heard that sound and did not feel afraid. They felt something closer to relief, because that sound meant someone was out there, past the tree line, past the coastline, past the edge of every map they had ever drawn. Something enormous was doing its job. The Norse people called him Thor, and what they believed about him was not what you might expect. They did not believe Thor was going to save them. They did not believe he was going to come down from the sky and fix their problems. They believed he was standing between them and something worse. That was enough. That was everything. He was not the wisest of the gods. He was not the most cunning. There were gods in the Norse tradition who could bend fate with words alone, who had traded pieces of themselves for knowledge that could reshape the world. Thor was not that kind of god. He was the kind who showed up, the kind who picked up the hammer and walked toward whatever was making the noise at the edge of the world. And here is the thing that most people do not fully understand about him. He knew how it was going to end. Every god in the Norse tradition knew. The ending had been written before the beginning was finished. There was going to be a final winter that lasted 3 years. The sea was going to rise. A serpent the size of the world was going to lift itself out of the deep water and fill the sky with poison. And Thor, the strongest thing in all the 9 worlds, was going to walk out to meet it. He would win. He would kill the serpent. And then he would take 9 steps and fall down dead. The Norse myths do not give us a clean biography of Thor. They give us fragments, poems, stories, image, names, and rituals. What follows is the shape those fragments make when placed around. One question: what does a god do when the world he was born to protect is already doomed? This is that story. All of it. In the beginning, the Norse did not build a paradise. They built a tree. Yggdrasil, the world tree. An ash so vast that its 3 roots stretched into 3 separate realms, and its branches scraped the sky above all 9 worlds. At one root sat a dragon named Nidhogg, who had been gnawing on the wood since before human memory began. At another root lay the well of wisdom. At the third, the well of fate, where 3 women sat, weaving the destinies of gods and men without pause, without mercy, without revision. The tree was always being damaged. The tree was always being tended. Those 2 things happened simultaneously, every single day, and neither one was winning. Picture what that means for a people who organized their entire understanding of reality around that image. Not a universe created perfect and then corrupted. Not a universe progressing towards some golden age. A universe in constant tension between the forces holding it together and the forces pulling it apart. And that tension is not a problem to be solved. It is the nature of things. The Norse called their version of the apocalypse Ragnarok. And Ragnarok was not a prophecy in the sense of something that might be avoided with the right choices. It was a scheduled event. The women at the Well of Fate had already written it. Odin knew. Thor knew. Every god in Asgard knew the date on their own death certificate. And they went about their lives anyway. This is the first thing that separates Norse mythology from almost every other tradition that has survived. Most creation stories feel, at least at first, like promises. Something good was made. Order was established. And the implication is that the order will hold if everyone does what they are supposed to do? The Norse looked at that kind of thinking and built something different. They looked at the dragon at the root of everything and said, plainly, that it was going to keep gnawing. So, what do you do with that? Odin's answer was knowledge. He hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days with a spear in his side to learn the secret of the runes. He traded one of his eyes to the giant Mjolnir for a single drink from the well of wisdom. Every sacrifice Odin made was pointed at the same destination. Understand Ragnarok well enough to find some angle in it. Some possibility the prophecy had not fully closed off. Thor's answer was different. Thor's answer was to pick up the hammer this morning and go deal with whatever was at the edge of the world today. Not because he had given up on the future, but because the future was going to happen regardless. And what needed taking care of right now was the giant, making trouble at the eastern border of Midgard. The farms were still there. The people were still there. The work was still the work. The 9 worlds of Norse mythology were not a clean hierarchy, with good at the top and evil at the bottom. They were a neighborhood. Complicated and old and full of people with long memories and longer grudges. Asgard, the realm of the gods. Midgard, the realm of humans. Connected to Asgard by the Rainbow Bridge, Bifrost. Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, who were older than the gods and had never entirely accepted the arrangement the gods had made of the world. Helheim, the realm of the ordinary dead. Niflheim, a world of ice and mist at the far edge of everything, and underneath all of it, always, the dragon, gnawing. The Norse built their entire cosmology around a truth that most traditions spend considerable energy avoiding. The things that sustain the world and the things that destroy it are operating at the same time, in the same place. And there is no final victory for either side. There is only the tending, the daily, unglamorous, unfinished work of keeping the structure from collapsing before today is over. They needed a god for that kind of work. They built Thor. Before we can understand who he was, we have to understand what he was walking into. A universe that did not promise safety. A cosmos that had scheduled its own destruction and posted the date where everyone could see it. A world that needed someone willing to go out every morning and do the maintenance work, knowing full well that the maintenance was never going to be finished. 2 answers to that world. One god who tried to understand the catastrophe well enough to find the angle in it, and one who walked out the door anyway. Both of them were right. That is the hardest part of the Norse tradition to hold on to. Both of them were right, and only one of them came home with thunder in his wake. To understand Thor, you have to understand what he was not. Odin gets the long chapters in the histories. Odin is the one scholars write books about, the one who shows up in poetry and philosophy and the dreams of kings. He is the Allfather, the god of war and wisdom and poetry and death, the one who hung himself from the world tree for 9 days with a spear in his side so that he could learn the secret of the runes. He traded one of his eyes to the giant Mimir for a single drink from the well of wisdom. Every morning he sent 2 ravens out into the world and waited for them to come back and tell him everything they had seen. Odin is the kind of figure who makes you feel, when you read about him, that you are in the presence of something genuinely ancient and genuinely strange. He does not operate by rules that humans recognize. His generosity always costs someone something. His wisdom is real, but it is not warm. He collects dead warriors for a reason, and the reason is not because he values their lives. He values what they will be worth to him at the end of the world. Thor was his son, and Thor was nothing like him. On a particular morning in Asgard, the kind of morning that looks ordinary until it is not, a messenger arrived with news that a group of giants had crossed into the territory bordering Midgard. They were not attacking yet. They were testing, pushing at the boundary, the way water pushes at a dam, not with intention, but with the patient. continuous pressure of things that move toward open space. Odin sat at his high seat and calculated. He thought about what this incursion meant for the larger picture, for the long game he had been playing since before most of the 9 worlds had names. He weighed the information against what he already knew, against the prophecies he had purchased at considerable personal cost, against the position of every piece on a board that only he could fully see. Thor was already gone. He had heard the news, picked up Mjolnir, and left. No calculation, no strategic review. The boundary needed holding, and he was the one who held it. And the road to the boundary was the same road it had always been. This is not a story about a god who was too simple to think. Thor thought clearly and quickly, and with the specific intelligence of someone who had been in a great many difficult situations and had learned exactly what kind of thinking those situations required. He was uninterested in complexity when directness would do, and in a tradition where the cleverest people, including his own father, were frequently making things worse with their cleverness. There was something to be said for the god who just went and dealt with what was in front of him. His mother was not a goddess of Asgard. This matters more than it might seem. Odin's official wife was Frigg, the queen of Asgard, wise and powerful, and very much a creature of that realm. But Thor's mother was Jord, not a poetic name, not a metaphor. The earth itself, the actual living ground beneath your feet, the soil that holds the roots of things, the bedrock that does not move when everything above it shifts. Thor was the son of the sky and the earth. He was the thunder that happened when those two things met. Before he was a god with a name and a hammer and a hall in Asgard. He was a weather event. He was the crack of electricity between the cloud and the ground. The reason crops grew and the reason storms could flatten them. Both things at once. Neither one cancelling the other out. The Norse farmers who heard thunder in the distance were not hearing the sound of a god doing something dramatic. They were hearing something that had been happening since before Asgard existed, since before any of the names were attached to any of the things. They were hearing the sound of the world talking to itself in its oldest language. Thor walked into that identity and wore it without conflict. He was large. Every source that describes him agrees on this. He was the largest of the gods. Red-bearded, built on a scale that suggested his mother's side of the family. When he walked through Asgard, things moved out of his way, not because they feared him. Exactly. But because that is what things do when something that size walks through a space. He ate enormous amounts. He drank enormous amounts. He had a temper that arrived fast and left fast, like the storms he was made of. And people who knew him had learned to wait out the first few minutes because the anger was real, but it was not permanent. It burned hot and it burned clean, and when it was over, it was over. He travelled by chariot, pulled by 2 goats named Tangrisnir and Tangjostra, Teeth-grinder and Teeth-barer, names that were not trying to be subtle. Every night, when he made camp, he killed the goats and ate them. Every morning he gathered their bones, laid them back inside the skins, and the goats came back to life. An endless provision for an endless journey. He did not arrive anywhere fat and comfortable. He arrived having used exactly what he had, ready to go again the next day. Odin sat at his high seat and watched the world through the eyes of 2 ravens. He saw everything and understood most of it, and used what he understood in the service of a plan that stretched from the beginning of time to the end of it. Thor came home from the eastern border that evening with mud on his boots and the particular quiet of someone who has done a thing that needed doing. He ate. He slept. In the morning, he asked what needed doing today. This is not simplicity. This is a different kind of wisdom. The wisdom of someone who has decided that the knowledge of the ending is not the reason to stop, that the work in front of you is real regardless of what is coming, that the farms and the people and the fires inside the longhouses are worth protecting for exactly as long as they can be protected, and not one day less. Odin worried about Ragnarok every waking hour. He should have. The worry was appropriate, and the preparations were real, and the warriors in Valhalla were there for a reason. Thor went outside. Both of them were right. The tradition needed both answers. But the one the ordinary people trusted, the one whose name they wore around their necks on cold mornings before the boats pushed off, was the one who went outside. Because, when the storm came, they did not want a god who had calculated its probability. They wanted the one who walked into it. It started with hair. Loki crept up on Sif while she was sleeping and cut off all her hair. Not some of it. All of it. Down to the scalp. Gone. In the dark. For no reason that was ever adequately explained except that the impulse arrived and Loki followed it. Because that was the kind of being Loki was, before the world had fully taught him what impulses cost. Sif's hair was not simply hair. In the Norse tradition, it was golden, the way wheat fields are golden in late summer, the kind of gold that meant the harvest was coming, that the land was still providing, that the thing you had worked toward all year was arriving on schedule. Her hair was a living image of abundance, and Loki had taken an axe to it in the night for no reason at all. Thor came home and found his wife with nothing on her head, and an expression the sources do not describe because they do not need to. What happened next required no description either. Thor's reaction when someone he loved had been casually violated was immediate and physical and left very little room for nuance. Loki ran. He was very good at running. He was also, eventually, very good at fixing what he had broken. He went to the realm of the dwarves, the master craftsman of the 9 worlds, and commissioned a replacement. Not just hair, but golden hair that would actually grow, that would move in the wind, that would be as real and living as what had been taken. And while he was there, feeling successful and somewhat invincible, he made a bet. He wagered his own head against the ability of 2 dwarf brothers, Sindri and Brokkr, to make 3 treasures that could match the 3 he was already bringing back. Brokkr worked the forge. Sindri worked the magic. The first 2 items came out perfect. A golden boar that could run across sky and sea and illuminate the night as it ran. A golden ring that would drip 8 copies of itself every 9 nights. Endless multiplication of wealth. Then they started on the hammer. Loki watched them work and slowly understood that he was going to lose the bet and that his head was genuinely at stake. So he did what Loki did. He transformed himself into a fly and bit Brokkr on the hand, while the dwarf was pumping the bellows that kept the forge at the heat the metal required. Brokkr kept going. Loki bit him again. Harder. On the neck this time. Brokkr kept going. On the 3rd attempt, Loki bit him on the eyelid hard enough to draw blood. Hard enough that Brokkr flinched. Hard enough that for just one moment, the steady rhythm on the bellows broke. Just one moment. The hammer came out of the forge with a handle too short. Not broken. Not useless. But shorter than the craftsman had intended. Shorter than the weapon deserved, given everything else about it. Brokkr and Sindri had poured everything they had into making something extraordinary, and what came out was extraordinary and imperfect in the same breath. The judges ruled that the hammer was still the most valuable of all the treasures. Loki kept his head through a legal technicality so slippery it could only have been constructed by someone whose life depended on it. And Mjolnir went to Thor. It could not be broken. It could not miss. It always returned to the hand that threw it. When it struck with the force of lightning, because it was lightning, because the thing Thor held in his hand was the same thing his mother had been part of since before the gods existed, and the handle was too short. This is not a footnote. This is the whole point. The short handle was a real functional limitation. A weapon of that power, made for a being of that size, should have given full leverage. Full control, the complete expression of what the metal was capable of. Instead, it had a handle that required Thor to adjust his grip, to work with the weapon rather than simply wield it, to accommodate a flaw that should not have been there and could not be removed. He never complained. Not once. In any source. Does Thor lament the handle? He took the hammer. He learned to use it as it was. And he used it for the rest of his existence. Think about everything that was done with that imperfect tool. Mjolnir, hallowed. It blessed. It was held over newborn children to bring them under Thor's protection. It was laid in the lap of a bride at a wedding to consecrate the marriage. When someone died and was sent out on a funeral pyre, Mjolnir was part of the ritual that sent them properly into the next life. The hammer that crushed giants was also the hammer that blessed babies and honored the dead. This is what gets lost in every version of Thor that strips the mythology down to a man with a weapon. He was not a god of destruction who happened to protect people as a side effect of enjoying the fight. He was a god of protection who used destruction when protection required it. The blessing came first. The crushing came when something threatened the thing that needed blessing. The Norse people who wore miniature Mjolnir pendants around their necks were not wearing a symbol of power. They were wearing a symbol of power with a flaw built into it by an act of sabotage. A flaw that had been accepted and worked around and incorporated into everything the weapon had ever done. When a Viking touched that pendant before a sea crossing or a harvest, they were touching something that understood imperfection in a deep way. That had been made in imperfection and had not failed. Not once. Loki's interference with the forge was the first thing he did that could not be fully repaired. The hair grew back. The treasures were delivered. The bet was settled, but the handle stayed short. Every time Thor swung Mjolnir, every giant driven back from the boundary of the organized world, every blessing laid on a child or a bride or a body being sent into the fire, all of it done with a hammer that carried inside it the permanent record of the moment. Loki's impulse had broken something that mattered. The tool you are given is not always the tool you would have chosen. The question is what you build with it. Thor built a wall between the world and everything that wanted to tear it apart. He built it one swing at a time, with a handle that was too short, made by craftsmen who had been working against sabotage. In a world that had already written its own ending, he built it anyway. And, for a very long time, it held. There is a line in Norse geography that does not appear on any map, but that everyone in the tradition understood perfectly. It was the line between the places where the rules held and the places where they did not, between the fire in the longhouse and the dark outside the door, between the field you had worked for 20 years and the forest at the edge of it, where the trees got too close together for the light to come through. On one side of that line, people were building something. Farms, families, fires that lasted through winter, the slow accumulation of a life that might outlast the person living it. On the other side, the forces that had existed before building was possible were still doing what they had always done. Not because they chose destruction, because that is what entropy does when there is no one pushing back against it. Thor lived on that line. Not in Asgard, making decisions. Not at the well of wisdom, accumulating knowledge. At the boundary itself, in the cold and the dark, where the organized world got thin and started to fray, doing the work that allowed everything on the other side of the line to continue existing. The beings he faced out there were called the Jotnar, giants, in most translations. But that word carries the wrong weight. It makes you picture something large and stupid, a creature that is essentially a bigger, slower version of a person. Dangerous, the way a falling tree is dangerous. That is not what the Jotnar were. They were old, older than the gods, older than Asgard. The first of them, Ymir, was the raw material from which the world had been built. The earth was his flesh. The mountains were his bones. The sky was his skull. The gods had made everything from a Jotun body and then told the Jotnar that the world now belonged to order, to structure, to the arrangement the gods had decided on. You can understand why the Jotnar might have some feelings about that. Some of them were enormous. Some of them were brilliant. Some of them were both. Which was the most dangerous combination? Odin himself had Jotun blood through his mother. Several of the gods had taken Jotun spouses. The line between Asgard and Jotunheim was not the line between good and evil. It was the line between order and the forces that pulled against it. And even that line was not clean. One giant, Hrungnir, made it all the way to Asgard. He arrived after a horse race with Odin, drunk on the god's mead and the particular arrogance of someone who had just beaten the Allfather in a contest and had not yet understood what that meant for his continued existence. He stood in the hall of the gods and began making threats. He was going to sink Asgard into the sea. He was going to carry off the goddesses. He was going to do several other things that the assembled divine beings of the Norse world found deeply objectionable. None of them moved to stop him. They sent for Thor. What followed was not a simple demonstration of strength. Hrungnir had a heart of stone, and a skull of stone, and a shield of stone. And he hurled a whetstone at Thor when the god came toward him. Thor threw Mjolnir at the same moment. The whetstone shattered in mid-air, and one piece buried itself in Thor's forehead. Mjolnir hit Hrungnir in the skull, and Hrungnir fell. And as he fell, his enormous leg came down across Thor's chest and pinned him to the ground. The gods tried to lift it. Every divine being present attempted to move the body of the fallen giant. None of them could. It was Thor's 3-year-old son, Magni, who walked over, lifted the leg without visible effort, and freed his father. Thor gave Magni the horse that had started the whole event. Odin objected, said the horse should have gone to him. Thor dismissed the objection without ceremony. The horse went to the one who had earned it. The piece of whetstone stayed in Thor's head. A seeress tried to remove it with spells. Thor interrupted her concentration mid-ritual by telling her that her long-lost husband was alive and on his way home. She was so overwhelmed by the news that she lost the thread of the incantation, and the stone could not be dislodged. He carried a fragment of his enemy in his skull for the rest of his existence. Not as a wound he was always attending to. As a fact, he had incorporated the permanent record that every victory leaves something behind, that you do not go into the fight and come out exactly as you went in. He did not complain about this either. This is the portrait the sources build, piece by piece, of what Thor actually was in relation to his enemies. A god who got close enough to the trouble that the trouble put a piece of itself inside him. Who came back from the encounter changed and went out again the next time. The Jotnar were not going to stop. That was not in their nature, any more than it is in the nature of the sea to stop moving against the shore. But as long as someone was willing to go out to where they were and do what needed doing, the middle held. The farms stayed. The children grew up. The fires in the longhouses burned through the winters. Thor was the reason the middle held, not because he was invincible, not because his enemies were weak, because he was willing to go back out. Every time, with a hammer that was a little too short and a piece of whetstone in his head and the full knowledge that the middle was not going to hold forever, he went back out anyway. The edge of the world is not a comfortable place to spend your existence. It is cold, and the things that live there have been there longer than you have, and they know the terrain better than you do. Thor went there constantly. He went because somebody had to, and because the people in the middle of the world who were trying to live their lives deserved to have someone standing at the edge of it. That was the arrangement. It was not glamorous. It did not make for the kind of story told at feasts, the kind with a clear arc and a satisfying resolution and a hero who gets to come home and rest. But the crops grew. The children survived the winter. The fires held against the dark. For now, for this season, he picked up the hammer. He walked out the door. There is a particular kind of friendship that keeps appearing across every tradition that has ever tried to tell stories about the way the world works. The friendship between the one who acts and the one who thinks. The one who meets the world with force and the one who meets it with language. The one whose power is visible and the one whose power is not. These friendships are almost always the most important relationship in the story. They are almost always, at some point, the most dangerous one too. Thor and Loki traveled together for a long time. Before we talk about what Loki became, we have to talk about what he was, because the tradition remembers him as a villain, as the architect of the worst things that happened in the Norse world. And that memory is not wrong, but it is incomplete in the way that knowing how a story ends is always incomplete. It tells you the destination without telling you the road. Loki was not a giant. Exactly. Though he had Jotun blood, he was not quite a god. Though he lived in Asgard and ate at the god's table and had sworn blood brotherhood with Odin himself, he was a shape changer. He could become a salmon, a mare, a fly, an old woman, a young man, whatever the situation required. He was the cleverest being in the 9 worlds by a margin that was not close. And he knew it. And that knowledge was both his greatest asset and the thing that would eventually break everything. He saw the world the way very intelligent people sometimes see it, which is to say, he saw it clearly, without the comfortable fictions that allow most people to function inside imperfect systems without going quietly insane. He looked at Asgard and saw the vanity alongside the courage. He looked at the arrangement the gods had made of the world and saw all the places where that arrangement was more performance than reality. He looked at the prophecy of Ragnarok and saw a game that was already over, with everyone still playing as though the outcome was in question. Knowing all of that, he still sat at the table. He still traveled the roads with Thor. He still showed up when the situation required him, which it did, regularly, because there were entire categories of problem that Thor's approach could not address. Thor was direct. He was effective. He was the hammer that drove the nail and asked no further questions about the philosophy of nails. But the 9 worlds contained problems that directness made worse. Situations where the person who walked in looking like exactly what he was would walk straight into a disaster that a more flexible approach would have avoided. Loki was the flexible approach. On the road to Jotunheim once, they stopped for the night in what seemed to be a large building, wide-roomed and oddly proportioned, with a side chamber that offered some shelter from the noise that kept rumbling through the main hall. They slept. The noise was considerable, the kind that suggested a geological event somewhere nearby. In the morning they discovered that they had been sleeping in the glove of a giant named Skrymir. The rumbling was his snoring. Thor did not find this amusing. He picked up Mjolnir and hit Skrymir in the head while the giant slept, putting enough force into the blow to level a building. Skrymir woke up and asked whether a leaf had fallen on him. Thor hit him again, harder, a strike that would have ended most things. Skrymir wondered if an acorn had dropped from a branch above. Thor waited until the giant was deeply asleep and swung a 3rd time with everything he had. Skrymir mentioned, drowsily, that a bird might have dropped something. He got up, wished them well, and walked in a different direction. Loki watched all of this without comment. He had developed, over the years of traveling with Thor, a very accurate sense of when commentary was useful and when it was not. The moment when the strongest being in the 9 worlds had just struck an apparently ordinary giant 3 times with the hammer of lightning and produced no visible effect was, in Loki's assessment, not a moment for commentary. But he had noticed something. He always noticed something. The noticing was what made him what he was, and what made him dangerous, and what made him, for a long stretch of time, genuinely indispensable. What Loki brought to the partnership was not just cleverness. It was a different way of reading the world. When Thor looked at a problem, He saw what needed to be overcome. When Loki looked at the same problem, he saw the angles, the soft spots, the places where the apparent solidity of things was more assumption than fact. Two ways of seeing that were both correct, and that together were considerably more useful than either one alone. They travelled to Jotunheim together more times than the sources fully record. They sat in the halls of giants and endured tests and contests and the particular variety of hospitality that contains a weapon inside it. They navigated situations where the wrong word or the wrong move would have ended badly and came out the other side. Most of the time, with what they had come for. And through all of it, running underneath the friendship, like a current under a river, was the question that Loki kept asking and never quite stopped asking. If you can see that the arrangement is failing, that the structure has cracks that cannot be repaired, that the story ends the way it ends, regardless of how hard the strongest god in the 9 worlds swings his hammer, then what exactly is the point of maintaining the arrangement? Thor had an answer. It was not a philosophical answer. It was a physical one. You went out every morning and picked up the hammer and went to wherever the trouble was. The point was the going. The point was the work. The ending did not change what needed doing today. Loki could understand that answer. He could follow the logic of it, trace its shape, see why someone would choose to live by it. But understanding an answer is not the same as being able to live by it. And Loki had been staring at the cracks in the structure for too long to look away from them the way the answer required. Thor did not see the erosion happening. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of category. Thor understood breaks. He understood the thing in front of him. He understood enemies that came from a direction and could be met from a direction. Loki was not in front of him. Loki was beside him. That was why the damage took so long to see, and why, when it finally became visible, it was already too late to address. For a long time, though, the friendship was real. The road was long, and the nights in Jotunheim were cold, and the situations they walked into together were genuinely dangerous. And there is a specific kind of bond that forms between people who have faced difficult things together and come out the other side. Loki was getting heavier, slowly. Across the long arc of the mythology, the cleverness was curdling, not because something specific happened to change him, because the question he had always been asking was not getting a satisfying answer. But that comes later. For now, there is a road into Jotunheim, and 2 beings walking it, and the specific laughter that comes from people who find each other, against the odds. Genuinely good company. That part was real. It mattered that it was real, because what it eventually became would not have hurt the way it did if what came before it had not been genuine. Thor woke up one morning and reached for Mjolnir. It was not there. He checked the obvious places. He checked the less obvious places. He got up and searched the hall with the focused energy of someone who already knows the thing is not where it should be, but cannot yet accept what that means. Mjolnir was not in the hall. It was not anywhere in Asgard. It was gone. He went to find Loki. Not because Loki had taken it. Thor knew Loki well enough to know the difference between the kind of trouble Loki caused and the kind of trouble this was. He went to Loki because Loki was the one who could find things that did not want to be found, who could move through the 9 worlds in shapes that attracted no attention, who had developed over centuries of causing and fixing problems a very accurate understanding of where things went when they disappeared. Loki borrowed Freya's falcon cloak and flew out over the 9 worlds. He came back with news. A giant king named Thrym had Mjolnir. He had taken it from wherever Thor had left it, buried it 8 miles underground, and was prepared to negotiate its return. His price was simple. He wanted Freya as his bride. Freya was the goddess of love and war, one of the most powerful beings in Asgard, and the absolute last person in the 9 worlds who was going to agree to be traded to a giant king like a piece of property. When the gods brought her this proposal, she declined with enough force that her famous necklace shattered from the impact of her reaction. The hall shook. Several gods took a step backward without being fully aware they were doing it. So Freya was not available as a solution. The gods convened. Someone had to go to Thrym. Someone had to walk into the hall of a giant king who had buried the world's most important defensive weapon 8 miles underground and retrieve it without starting a war that Asgard, currently without its primary protection. He could not afford to fight. Heimdall, who was known for seeing clearly and thinking ahead, offered a suggestion. Thor should dress as the bride. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Thor was not a person who could easily be mistaken for anything other than what he was. He was the largest god in Asgard, red-bearded, built like the sun of the earth, which he literally was. The suggestion that he could pass as a bride required either extraordinary costuming or a giant king who was not paying very close attention. As it turned out, Thrym was not paying very close attention. Thor objected to the plan. His objections were reasonable and entirely beside the point. Without Mjolnir, Asgard's primary defense was a god in a dress. That was the situation. Every other consideration was secondary. Loki talked him into it, not with a long argument, with one sentence without the hammer. The giants take everything. Thor stood there for a moment and then went to put on the dress. They dressed him as a bride. They put a veil over his face. They arranged his beard as best they could, which was not very well. Loki went as the bridesmaid. Because of course Loki went as the bridesmaid. They rode to Jotunheim in a chariot that produced considerably more lightning than was traditional for a bridal procession. Thrym was delighted. He had wanted this for a long time. And here it was, arriving in a chariot. He welcomed his bride to the high seat, and the feast began. Thor ate an ox. He ate 8 salmon. He ate all the appetizers that had been set aside for the women of the hall. He drank 3 barrels of mead. Thrym leaned over to Loki and mentioned, with the careful politeness of a host who has noticed something unusual about his guest, that he had never seen a bride with quite that appetite. Loki explained that the bride had been so eager for this wedding that she had not eaten in 8 days. Brides were like that. Thrym decided to kiss his new wife before the ceremony. He lifted the veil and looked into the eyes beneath it and recoiled. What looked back at him was burning with something that was not appropriate to find in the eyes of a woman on her wedding night. Something that was much more appropriate to find in the eyes of a being who had been holding very still for a very long time while waiting for a specific moment to arrive. Loki explained that the bride had been so eager for this wedding that she had not slept in 8 days either. Thrym called for Mjolnir. He wanted to consecrate the marriage properly, to place the hammer in the bride's lap according to Norse custom, the hallowing of a union, the ritual that made the thing official. A servant carried Mjolnir out and placed it in the bride's lap. What happened next took less time than everything that had come before it. The sources say that Thor's heart laughed when he felt Mjolnir in his hands. This is not a metaphor. The sensation of the handle in his grip, the specific weight of it, the feeling of the hammer that existed for him, and nothing else. That was the moment when everything that had been compressed inside him since he woke up to find it gone released at once. Thrym died. His sister died. The assembled guests of the wedding feast died. The hall of Jotunheim that had briefly held Mjolnir in its walls was very rapidly no longer in any condition to hold anything. Thor and Loki came home. The hammer came with them. Now here is what the joke version of this story leaves out. Thrym had understood something important. He had looked at the arrangement of the 9 worlds, at the defense structure that kept Asgard and Midgard functional, and he had found its weakness, not Thor's strength. The question of what happened when the strength was elsewhere. He had taken the measure of the situation and discovered that the wall was only as strong as the being who held it. and the being who held it could be separated from the thing that gave the wall its force. He had been right. For the duration of that separation, he had dictated terms to Asgard. The gods had convened and deliberated, and ultimately decided that the best available path was to send their strongest fighter in a wedding dress rather than risk whatever Thrym might do if pushed. The giant had leverage, and he had used it. The hammer came back. The fact that it could be taken did not unhappen, and something else had been demonstrated. In the absence of Mjolnir, the best solution available to the gods was a disguise. Thor had sat through a feast in a vale, managed his appetite for 8 salmon into something that could be explained away, endured Thrym's curiosity and the weight of the veil and the management of the whole performance. And he had done it without complaint. He had not let his dignity be the thing that cost the world its protection. Most people, faced with the choice between their pride and the safety of everything they were responsible for protecting, would have found a reason why the compromise was not acceptable. Thor put on the dress and went to the feast. That is the part of the story that matters after the laughter stops. The willingness of the strongest being in the 9 worlds to look ridiculous in service of what he was there to protect. The wedding guests of Jotunheim found out exactly what he was when the veil came off. The hammer was home. The wall was back up. For now. There was a journey Thor made into Jotunheim that did not end with a giant dying. It ended with a conversation, with Thor walking away from that conversation and heading back toward Midgard, carrying something he had not brought with him, something heavier than anything he had lifted before, something that had no physical weight at all. It is the most important story in the entire mythology. They traveled east. Thor and Loki and the 2 young humans, Thjalfi and Roskva, the farmers' children who had come into Thor's service after an incident with a goat that the sources describe briefly, and that resulted in permanent arrangements for all parties involved. The 4 of them moved through Jotunheim, which was larger than it should have been. Larger in a way that was not just physical but experiential. The kind of large where you walk all day and the horizon does not change. The first night, they found shelter in what seemed to be a wide hall with unusual proportions. They slept in a side chamber. During the night, a sound like sustained thunder moved through the main hall, disturbing enough that they shifted positions several times before finding a spot where it was manageable. In the morning, they discovered they had been sleeping in the glove of a giant named Skrymir. The sound had been snoring. Skrymir offered to travel with them and carry their provisions. At the end of the day, he went to sleep, and Thor, hungry, tried to open the bag of food. The knots would not come loose. He tried with both hands. He tried with everything he had. The bag stayed shut. Thor picked up Mjolnir and hit Skrymir in the head. Skrymir woke up and asked whether a leaf had fallen on him. Thor hit him again. A blow that would have ended most things in the 9 worlds. Skrymir wondered if an acorn had dropped. Thor waited until deep in the night and struck a 3rd time, with the full force of what he was. The strike that was supposed to be beyond the ability of anything to survive. Skrymir thought a bird might have dropped something from a branch above. He got up in the morning, pointed them toward the fortress of Utgard, wished them well, and walked in a different direction. The fortress of Utgard had walls so high they had to crane their necks all the way back to see the tops. The gates were locked. They squeezed through the bars. Inside, a king named Utgard Loki received them with the specific hospitality that contains a test inside it. No one sat at his table without demonstrating excellence in some skill. Loki went first. He claimed to be the fastest eater in the 9 worlds and was matched against a being named Logi. The contest was real. Loki ate with genuine speed and genuine commitment, and at the end he had consumed all the meat from his side of the trough. Loki had consumed the meat, the bones, the trough, and the table it sat on. Thjalfi ran against a young man named Hugi. He ran as fast as he had ever run. Hugi was back at the finish line waiting for him before he was halfway there. Then Thor was given 3 challenges. He chose drinking first, because he could drink. The horn was a reasonable size, the kind that passed around at feasts, and he lifted it and drank until his lungs had no room left. The level in the horn had dropped slightly. Not enough. He drank again. Everything he had. Still not enough. A third time. Past the point where he thought he could go. The horn was no longer completely full. Utgard Loki observed that this was a modest performance for someone of his reputation. The second challenge was a cat. A large grey cat. Ordinary in appearance. The kind that lived around any hall. Thor was asked to lift it from the floor. He bent down, got his hands under it, and pulled. 1 paw left the ground. He strained until the tendons in his neck stood out, and his face went the color of the sky before a serious storm, and the cat arched upward. 1 paw off the ground. And that was everything he had. The third challenge was wrestling. His opponent was an old woman named Ellie, brought from the back of the hall. Ancien, bent, small. Thor was reluctant. Wrestling old women is not a contest that reflects well on anyone, regardless of how it ends. He wrestled her anyway. She did not go down. She was immovable in the specific way that certain things are immovable. Not because they resist your force, but because your force finds nothing in them to act on. The harder he pushed, the more settled she seemed. Eventually he was the one on one knee. He had lost all 3 contests. He slept in Utgard that night, and in the morning Utgard Loki walked them to the edge of the territory and told them the truth. There had been no Skrymir. The giant was Utgard Loki himself, wearing a different shape. The knots on the bag had been sealed with iron bound by magic. When Thor swung Mjolnir at his head 3 times, the blows had been redirected into the landscape. The 3 valleys they could see cut into the hills behind them, deep as canyons, were where the strikes had landed. If those strikes had landed on an actual skull, there would be no skull. Loki, who had beaten Loki at eating, was fire. Nothing out-eats wildfire. Hugi, who had outrun Thialfi, was thought. Nothing outruns thought. The drinking horn had been connected to the sea. Thor had drunk enough to make the tides change along every coastline in Midgard. The sources say this plainly. Something that no being had done before, and that no being would do again. The cat was Jormungandr, the world's serpent, the creature that wrapped itself around Midgard and bit its own tail. The serpent that Thor was fated to fight at the end of the world. When Thor had lifted 1 paw from the floor, he had moved part of the serpent that encircled the entire world. Utgard Loki said that when he saw it happen, when he saw the cat arch upward and understood what was being lifted, everyone in the hall had gone pale. The old woman was Ellie, age itself, old age, the force that comes for everything, that no strength outlasts, that no hammer drives away. Thor had not emptied the horn because no being can drink the sea. He had not lifted the cat because you cannot lift the weight of the world's boundary with your hands. He had not defeated age because nothing defeats age. Yet, that word stood on its own in the middle of everything Utgard Loki was saying. Yet, Thor had moved the sea enough to change the tides on every coastline. He had lifted the foot of the creature that encircled Midgard. He had held his own against the force that ends everything longer than Utgard Loki had thought possible. Long enough that the king of Utgard had made the calculation that a direct confrontation with Thor, without the illusions, without the misdirection, was a confrontation he did not want to have. That was why the fortress would not be there when Thor came back. Utgard Loki said this plainly. Thor was already planning to return and have the direct version of this encounter. The king of Utgard looked at him and decided that the fortress and everything in it needed to be somewhere else before that happened. The fortress disappeared. The road back to Midgard was just a road. The landscape had nothing to show for what had happened in it, except 3 valleys, deep and raw, cut by strikes that had been aimed at something that was not there. Thor stood at the edge of Jotunheim and held 2 things at once. The world is bigger than any strength. That is a true statement, and the Norse tradition made it a true statement, and then demonstrated it through the cleverest antagonist Thor had ever faced. There are forces that cannot be overcome. The sea cannot be drunk. Age cannot be wrestled into submission. The weight of the world's boundary cannot be lifted by any single pair of hands. And yet, he had moved the sea. He had lifted the foot of the thing he was going to die fighting. He had stood against age longer than anything should be able to stand. He walked back toward Midgard carrying both of those things, the limitation and the extraordinary expression of the strength within the limitation, both real, neither one erasing the other. He did not know yet that the paw he had lifted was connected to the thing waiting for him at the end of the road. He did not know that the cat in the hall of Utgard and the creature in the water at the edge of the world were the same. He found out later. But even if he had known in that moment, standing at the border of Jotunheim, with the wind coming off the mountains and the road back to Midgard stretching out ahead of him, it would not have changed what he did next. He walked back. The farms were still there. The people were still there. The work was still the work. On a morning in the 9th century, somewhere along the Norwegian coast, a fisherman pushed his boat into the water before the sun came up. He had done this so many times that the sequence of movements was no longer voluntary. The hands knew where to go. The body knew what to lean against and what to push with, and how to read the resistance of the water against the hull in the dark. He did not think about the process. He thought about the weather. The sky to the west had a particular quality that morning. Not threatening yet, but moving. The clouds were doing something at the edge of the horizon that required attention. He looked at them for a long moment, calculated against everything he knew about this stretch of water and this time of year, and decided the window was sufficient. He would go out. He would pay attention. He would come back when the window closed. Before he pushed off, he touched the small hammer pendant at his throat. Not a prayer exactly, not a request for specific intervention or a guarantee of safe return. Something closer to an acknowledgement, a brief physical gesture that meant, I know you are out there. I know the work is being done. I am going to do my work now. Then he pushed off, and the dark water took the hull, and he was already thinking about the fishing. This is who Thor actually belonged to. Not the kings, not the poets in the halls of great men composing verses about divine genealogies, not the warriors who dedicated their lives to Odin in exchange for a death in battle and a seat in Valhalla. Those people had their gods. And the relationship between high-status Norse people and the more aristocratic members of their pantheon was real and important. But the farmer who needed rain at the right time, not too much and not too little. The fisherman reading the sky before the boats went out. The woman watching her child through a winter that was taking children that year. The small hammer worn smooth from the number of times it had been held. The blacksmith whose work kept the farm running and the boats floating, whose work would never make him famous, but whose work was the reason the whole structure held together. These people had Thor. The contrast with Odin is worth sitting with, because the Norse understood it very clearly. Odin demanded. He was not a comfortable god to have. He took his eye. He took his ease. He took the warriors he wanted for Valhalla in ways the warriors did not always choose and their families did not always welcome. He was brilliant and necessary and cold in the way that very large minds are sometimes cold, operating on a scale where individual human lives are variables in a calculation rather than ends in themselves. Thor asked nothing from the people who wore his symbol. He did not require the kind of sacrifice Odin required. He did not demand that his worshippers pursue excellence in some narrow field to earn his attention. He was available to the ordinary person doing the ordinary work of keeping themselves and the people they loved alive in the conditions that Northern Europe, in the early medieval period presented. Those conditions were not forgiving. The growing season in Scandinavia was short. The soil, in many places, was poor. The sea was beautiful and absolutely indifferent to whether the people who went out on it came home. The winters arrived with a completeness that people in more temperate climates do not experience. The kind of winter that does not inconvenience but kills, that does not care about your plans or your children or the stores you laid up in autumn. Into that world, the Norse placed a god who understood work, not the glamorous work of conquest or the elevated work of wisdom or the tragic work of the warrior who dies magnificently, the work of every morning, the work of hands that know what they are doing, the work that gets done regardless of how tired you are or how cold it is or whether anyone is going to notice it was done at all. Thor was the god of thunder and rain, which meant he was the god of the thing that decided whether the harvest came in. When thunder rolled in during the growing season, the farmers of Scandinavia were not covering their ears. They were looking up, reading the sky, paying attention to whether the rain was coming with it or whether this was a dry storm. They knew how to read his moods because they had been reading weather all their lives. A god who expressed himself through weather was a god they had a working relationship with. A practical familiarity built over seasons of paying close attention to the same sky. This practicality extended to how they wore his symbol. The Mjolnir pendants that have been found across Scandinavia and the Viking diaspora were not exclusively the property of warriors or priests. They appear in the graves of men and women who showed no signs of having been warriors. In the settlements that Norse people built when they moved across the North Atlantic to Iceland and Greenland, and eventually to the coast of North America, the hammer went with them because Thor went with them, not because he was going to fight their battles for them, but because wherever they went, there was going to be weather, there was going to be work, there was going to be the need for someone to be standing at the edge of the inhabited world, keeping the chaos out long enough for the people inside to live their lives. During the period when Christianity was spreading north through Scandinavia, something happened at the level of ordinary people that the official historical record tends to underreport. The missionaries arrived and found a tradition that was not dying. They found communities where the hammer pendant was on doors and around necks and pressed into foundations. They found that the competition for ordinary people's religious loyalty was not between a sophisticated theology and a primitive superstition. It was between two different sets of relationships with the divine. And the relationships built around Thor were deep and practical and not easily replaced. The surviving sources from that period include accounts of Mjolnir pendants and Christian cross pendants appearing together at the same sites, sometimes on the same individual. People navigating between two systems with the same pragmatic intelligence they brought to everything else, holding on to what worked, testing what was new. What they were holding on to, when they held on to the hammer, was a specific quality of divine presence. The god who was not above the work, the god who went out into the bad weather instead of waiting for it to pass, the god whose strength was not held in reserve for special occasions, but was spent continuously on the unglamorous and necessary task of keeping the edge of the world from swallowing the middle. That morning on the Norwegian coast, the fisherman pushed off into the dark. He was not asking for calm seas. He was not asking for a guarantee. He was acknowledging the arrangement. There is someone out there doing the hard work that makes this water crossable. I am going to do my part. You do yours. The thunder, when it came later that morning from the west, did not frighten him. It meant someone was working. There is a lake in the territory of a giant named Hymir, and the water in it is the color of iron in winter. And if you stood at its edge and dropped a stone in, it would take a very long time before it stopped falling. Thor arrived there in the form of a young man, because there are places where showing up as yourself is not the most productive beginning. Hymir was old and powerful, and not particularly interested in guests who announced their intentions before sitting down to eat. Thor told him he wanted to go fishing in the morning. Hymir told him to find his own bait. Thor went to Hymir's herd and found the largest bull there, a black ox named Himinrajota, Heaven Bellower, which was exactly the kind of name a bull had when it belonged to a giant whose territory bordered the edge of the known world. He pulled off the bull's head and carried it back to the boat. Hymir, who had seen a great many things in his long existence, made no comment. They rowed out in the morning. Hymir rowed to his usual fishing spot, the place he had been fishing for longer than most things had existed, and he stopped. This was far enough. This was where a reasonable being fished. Thor kept rowing. He rowed past where Hymir fished, past where the water looked like water, past the edge of the familiar world into the territory where the sea stopped being the sea and started being something else. The boundary between what was organized and what existed below and beyond organization. He stopped there. He baited the line with the bull's head. He dropped it into the water. He waited. The line went down. It went down for a long time. Hymir sat in the bow of the boat and watched and said nothing. But something in his posture changed. A tension that had not been there when they pushed off from shore. Something about where they were. About the color of the water and the way the horizon looked from this position, was producing in the old giant the specific quality of unease that comes from being somewhere you understand, instinctively, you are not supposed to be. Then the line went taut. The boat tipped. The water around them began to move in a way that water does not move on its own. A movement that came from somewhere far below and spread outward from the point where the line entered the surface. Concentric rings moving away from them in every direction. Slow and very large. Thor set his feet against the hull. He wrapped the line around his hands. He pulled. He pulled with the kind of effort that lives past the edge of what a body believes it can do. The sources describe it by saying his feet went through the hull of the boat and he stood on the bottom of the sea. Whatever the precise mechanics, what the image conveys is correct. He gave it everything. Not the managed exertion of an experienced fighter keeping something in reserve. Everything. The thing on the end of the line came up. The head of Jormungandr broke the surface, and what the sources preserve is a stillness. Not the stillness of nothing happening, but the stillness of two things recognizing each other across a distance that is also a kind of time. Thor, looking down. Jormungandr looking up. The god who was going to kill the serpent and the serpent that was going to kill the god. Face to face. For the first time. With nothing between them. The eyes of Jormungandr are described in the sources as full of poison and full of something else that is harder to name. Not hatred. Something more like the recognition of the other half of a fact. You are the thing I end. You are the thing that ends me. Here we both are. Earlier than scheduled. In a boat at the edge of the world. Thor reached for Mjolnir. Every source agrees on this. He would have done it. He would have ended it there. In the grey water at the edge of Hymir's territory. Decades before Ragnarok. The world serpent would have died in that boat. Without ceremony. Without the final winter. Without the 9 steps. Whatever the larger consequences might have been. In that specific moment, Thor had what he needed to finish it. Hymir cut the line. He reached past Thor and cut the fishing line, and Jormungandr slid back under the water. The surface closed. The concentric rings moved outward and faded. The water was flat again, and the sky above it was the same sky it had always been, and the boat sat in the water with a hole in its hull where Thor's feet had gone through. Hymir had looked into those eyes too. He had seen what was on the end of the line, and his hands had moved before he could think clearly about whether what he was doing was right or defensible by any standard. He cut the line because he was a creature of the living world, looking at something too large for the living world to contain. And the oldest instinct of the living world is to put distance between itself and what it cannot contain. He was not wrong. Exactly. He was also not right. He was just a being who had been somewhere he was not supposed to be, and had done what hands do when the mind cannot catch up fast enough to stop them. Thor was furious. The sources say he hit Hymir with his fist, and that Hymir went into the water. They say Thor waded to shore and stood there, looking back at the surface that was now just surface again. He stood there for a while. He had been close enough that the sources record what the serpent's eyes looked like from that distance. Close enough that Hymir's assessment of the situation had bypassed every layer of giant wisdom he had accumulated and gone straight to his hands. Thor had been close enough to change the ending of the story, and the story had sent Hymir's hands to the knife. There is a specific kind of loss that has no name, because it is not quite loss. The thing you had your hands on and then did not. The moment that was real, that existed, that was in the process of happening, and then was not. Thor had held the line. He had felt the weight on the other end of it. He had looked into the eyes of his own ending and reached for the hammer. And then the water was flat. He turned away from the lake and walked back toward Midgard. He took with him something he had not brought, not just the knowledge that Jormungandr existed, which he had always known, not just the knowledge that they were fated for each other, which the prophecy had always stated, something more immediate than either of those things, the knowledge of what it felt like to be in the same physical space as the thing that was going to kill him, to have held the moment, to have felt the weight on the line. He knew now what the last day of his life was going to feel like. He went back out the next morning anyway, and the morning after that, and every morning between that lake at the edge of Hymir's territory and the day the final winter began. The water went flat. The ripples faded. Below the surface, in the dark, the world serpent settled back to the bottom and waited. It was patient in the way that things which live without light learn patience. It had been waiting since before the world had a name for what waiting was. But it had looked up. It had seen what was coming. And in those eyes, in the moment before Hymir's hands moved, something had passed between them that was not hatred and not fear, something that two things feel when they recognize each other as the completion of the same fact. This was not the end. The end was going to feel exactly like this. There is a hall in Asgard called Bilskirner. The sources describe it as the largest building in the 9 worlds. 540 rooms, built on a scale that matched the being who lived in it. It sat in a region of Asgard called Thrudheim, land of strength, and everything about it suggested function rather than elegance, not the refined halls of the more aristocratic gods. A place built to hold something large and to hold it well. Thor came home to it. Between the journeys and the fights, and the long seasons spent at the edges of the organized world, he came back to Bilskirner the way people come back to the place that knows their weight, where the door fits and the fire is in the right position, and the dimensions of the rooms have been learned by the body over so many returns that it moves through them without thinking. He came back to Sif. The mythology does not give Sif as many pages as she deserves. She appears. She is significant. And then the narrative moves on to the next adventure. This is a failure of the sources, not a reflection of her actual place in the story, because Sif is not a supporting character in Thor's life. She is the reason the story has weight. Her hair was gold. The Norse tradition was not being poetic when it described it that way. It was being precise. The gold of Sif's hair was the gold of wheat fields in late summer when the harvest was coming in. The gold that meant abundance, continuity, the promise that the land was going to keep providing. She was the living image of the thing Thor was out there protecting, not an abstraction, not a map, a person with gold hair and a specific face in a specific hall. And when Thor walked back through the door of Bilskirner, he was walking back to the thing that made everything else make sense. When Loki cut her hair in the dark, he did not just damage a person. He made visible something that had always been true, but that no one had wanted to look at directly. The things that sustain life can be taken in the night by someone who simply decides to take them. The gold grew back. The craftsman of the deep places made it real and living again. But the moment of its absence had happened. It did not unhappen. Thor understood what had been taken. And when he came home to Sif, when he walked back through the door after months at the edges of the world, he was walking back to the evidence that what he was doing out there mattered, that there was something specific on the other side of all that work. Their children made the hall into a home rather than a very large building. Mjolnir and Modi. The names Thor gave his sons were not subtle. Strength and courage. Names that announced what the world was going to need from them. Given by a father who looked at the world clearly and named his children for what it required rather than what he wished it were. Magni was already extraordinary at 3 years old, the moment he lifted the dead giant's leg off his father's chest, the act that no assembled god of Asgard had been able to accomplish. He demonstrated something that Thor recognized immediately. The horse went to Magni, not as a gift, but as an acknowledgement. The boy had done something that deserved to be seen, and Thor was not the kind of person who let the seeing be implied. Modi carried his father's anger. The hot, clean kind that arrived fast and left fast, that was never cold or calculated but was always honest about itself. The kind of anger that is not a flaw but a form of clarity. The body's way of saying, this is wrong, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Both of them were going to survive Ragnarok. Thor knew this. The prophecy was specific. His sons were going to be standing in whatever came after the end of everything, and between them they were going to carry Mjolnir into that new world. He was raising them for a future he would not see, for work that would need doing after he was no longer available to do it. Think about what it means to know that, to look at your children eating enormous amounts and arguing with each other and learning the shape of who they are, and to understand that you are preparing them for a world you will not be part of, that the thing you have spent your existence protecting is going to need protecting after you are gone, and the beings who will do that protecting are currently in your hall, still growing into their names. It is the kind of knowledge that could make every departure harder. It did not stop the departures. This is the quality of Thor's situation that the mythology never quite states directly, but that runs through every account of him. He had the home, and he kept leaving it. Not because the leaving was easy, not because the work was more important to him than the people, but because the work was the reason the people could exist safely. The hall in Thrudheim, with the fire in the right position, was only available to the people inside it because someone was doing the maintenance on the world outside it. You do not get to have the home and not do the work that makes the home possible. Sif understood the arrangement. She had married a force of nature, and forces of nature move. They come back. They move again. What she had in the intervals was real, and the cost of those intervals was also real, and both things were part of the same truth. The mythology does not dwell on what the long absences cost her, because the mythology was written by people who understood that cost without it being named. The hall held when he was gone. The fire was kept. The children grew. Magni lifted things that should not have been liftable. Modi argued about things worth arguing about, and the gold of Sif's hair caught the afternoon light in the way that said the harvest was coming. The land was still providing. The thing you were afraid might not come back had come back. Then Thor came home, and the hall had all 540 rooms of it again. And the children demanded his attention in the way children demand things. Completely and immediately, and with the confidence that the attention will be given. He gave it. When he was in Bilskirnir, he was in Bilskirnir. The battle fury and the weather, and the enormous consuming work of being the wall between order and entropy. He left that outside. The people in the hall had all of him that was available. The available part got smaller sometimes. The road takes things. Every return is the return of someone slightly different from the person who left, changed by what was faced and what was done and what was seen. Thor had stood in a boat at the edge of the world and looked into the eyes of Jormungandr and come home with that knowledge sitting behind his own eyes. Sif saw it in him. She did not ask about it. She let the hall be the hall and the fire be the fire. That is not a small thing. To hold open a space where someone who does the work that Thor did can come back and be somewhere other than the work. Magni and Modi grew up watching their father leave and watching him come back. They learned something in the watching that was never explicitly taught. The leaving was not abandonment. The leaving was the other side of the love. If what was inside the hall did not matter, there would be no reason to go out and protect what was outside it. The hammer was not separate from the home. It was the reason the home existed. When the time came for them to lift Mjolnir in a world their father had died, making possible, they would know what they were holding. Not a weapon. The weight of every departure and every return. Every morning their father had walked out the door, when walking out was the last thing a person would choose. Compressed into a handle that was just a little too short. They would know because they had been in the hall when he came home, and in the hall when he left, and in the hall in the long spaces between. Hercules had 12 labors. They had a number. They had an end. Thor had every morning. This is the difference that the mythology never states directly, but that structures everything about how the two traditions understand heroism. Hercule was given a sentence, specific tasks, specific number, specific moment when the work would be finished and the obligation would be discharged and he could stop. The shape of his heroism was the shape of a man serving a term, and what came after the term was the question the story spent considerable effort exploring. Thor was not serving a term. There was no number of giants killed that would mean the boundary no longer needed tending. There was no point at which the work would be completed, and he could walk back through the gates of Bilskirnir and hang up the hammer for good. The giants came back because entropy came back. Because the forces pressing against the organized world did not diminish when they were temporarily overcome. They renewed themselves with the seasons. The pressure rebuilt. The next thing appeared at the boundary. He went. The year after, the whetstone went into his head, and Magni lifted the giant's leg, and the horse changed hands. There was a giant named Geirrod who had figured out something that Thrym had also figured out, which was that the hammer was the point. Remove the hammer from the equation, and the equation changes. Geirrod captured Loki and made Loki an offer: bring Thor to my hall without Mjolnir, without his belt of strength, without his iron gloves, and I will let you go. Loki, because being captured and threatened was a genuinely persuasive argument, brought Thor to Geirrod's hall without his usual equipment. Thor arrived with none of what made him what he was at full capacity. He had borrowed a belt and a staff from a giantess named Grid, who had her own reasons for not wanting Geirrod to succeed. He walked into a hall that had been arranged for his specific destruction, carrying borrowed tools and the accumulated intelligence of someone who had been in enough situations to know when he was walking into one. Geirrod's daughters tried to crush him against the ceiling using a raised platform. He used the staff to push back with sufficient force that the crushing went in the opposite direction. One of them threw a lump of molten iron at him with her bare hands, which tells you something about what kind of household Geirrod ran. And Thor caught it with the borrowed gloves and threw it back through the iron pillar Geirrod was hiding behind. The problem was resolved. He came home. The year after that. Different boundary. Different giant. Same work. This is the part of the Thor mythology that the dramatic individual encounters tend to obscure, because the encounters make for stories. They are what the sources preserve. And so, what we have is a series of remarkable individual moments that can create the impression of a heroic career defined by its peaks. What the sources do not fully capture is the texture of the valleys between the peaks, the ordinary ongoing labor of maintenance that the remarkable moments emerged from. Giants pushed at the boundary and Thor pushed back, not because he was chasing glory, not because each encounter was going to resolve the underlying situation, because the underlying situation was the condition, not the problem. The condition was a universe with entropy built into its structure, a universe that had scheduled its own destruction, and in the meantime required continuous effort to keep the structure functional for the lives being lived inside it. He was doing maintenance on a world that kept breaking. The world never thanked anyone for maintenance. It only noticed when the maintenance stopped. There is a quality that long work teaches that short work cannot. Not wisdom exactly, not the kind that comes from study or contemplation. The intelligence that a body and a mind develop when they have been solving the same category of problem in endlessly varying forms for longer than most things exist. Thor knew the edges of the organized world, the way the Norwegian fisherman knew his stretch of coast. Not from maps. From having been there in every kind of condition until the knowledge was in the body rather than the mind. He knew how certain kinds of trouble felt before it was fully visible. He knew which giants were dangerous in which specific ways. He knew the difference between a threat that needed immediate force and one that needed something else entirely. He knew. From Utgard and from the borrowed tools he had walked into Geirrod's hall with, that his strength was real and sufficient, and also not the answer to every question. The world not ending was the win. That sentence sounds simple. It is not simple. For most of what passes as heroism in most traditions, the win is visible. The dragon is dead. The city is saved. The impossible thing is accomplished and can be pointed to and named. The win is the kind of thing that gets a monument. Thor's wins were invisible. The farm that continued to exist because the boundary held one more season. The child who survived the winter because the summer had been sufficient. The boats that went out and came back because the sea had not been handed over to chaos. None of these wins left evidence. They were the absence of disasters that would have happened otherwise. And you cannot build a monument to an absence. He went out anyway. Every morning. The same hammer. The same road in the same direction. The same boundary that needed the same tending it had, needed the day before, and would need the day after. The scoreboard that nobody was keeping was entirely in his favor in the ways that mattered. The world was still there. For now. For this season. He picked up the hammer. He walked out the door. There is a way that trust erodes that does not look like erosion while it is happening. It does not arrive as a single break. It arrives as a series of small things. Each one individually explicable. Each one followed by a repair that almost works. Each one leaving behind a residue so thin you would not notice it if you were not paying very close attention. And then one day, you look at the thing you thought was solid, and you realize the residue has been accumulating for a very long time, and the thing is not solid at all. Loki had been accumulating residue for as long as anyone could remember. The hair was the beginning, or at least the beginning that the sources allow us to see. That nighttime destruction of something that belonged to someone he had no grievance with, for no reason that was ever adequately explained, because the impulse arrived and the impulse was acted on. The repair came quickly, and the repair was real. New hair. Better than what had been taken. Made by the finest craftsmen in the 9 worlds. The damage was addressed. But it had happened. Loki had stood over Sif in the dark and made a choice he had no right to make. He had done it not out of malice. Exactly. But out of something that is in some ways harder to address than malice. The casual assumption that he could. That the consequences would be manageable. That his cleverness would be sufficient to fix whatever his impulses broke. That assumption held for a very long time. His cleverness was sufficient. Repeatedly. To fix what his impulses broke. The things that came out of his problem-solving. Mjolnir itself. The golden hair. Various solutions that the gods found extremely useful. Were genuine contributions. He was not wrong about his ability to fix things. He was wrong about what the fixing cost. Not in material terms, but in the slow work it did on the trust that allowed him to remain part of the community. He was simultaneously breaking and repairing. By turns, Thor did not understand erosion. This is the important thing about him in relation to Loki. And it is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of category. Thor understood breaks. He understood the thing that came toward you from a direction and could be met from a direction. He understood enemies and borders and the specific grammar of direct confrontation. Loki was not in front of him. Loki was beside him. That was why the damage took so long to see. There was the time the gods nearly gave away everything. A builder appeared in Asgard and offered to construct new walls, stronger than anything existing, sufficient to withstand any assault. His price was the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freya. The gods, with Loki's encouragement, agreed on the condition that the work be done in a single winter with no human help. They thought the condition made it impossible. They had not thought clearly enough about what kind of being would make that offer. The builder had a horse, not an ordinary horse, a horse that could work through the night at a pace that made the timeline suddenly and terrifyingly plausible. As winter moved toward its end, the wall was nearly complete. The gods turned to Loki, because Loki had encouraged the deal, and the deal had gone wrong. And in the tradition that had developed around these situations, Loki was the one who fixed what Loki had enabled. He transformed into a mare and lured the builder's stallion away from the work. The builder, robbed of his horse and his timeline, revealed himself as a giant in disguise. Thor dealt with him. The wall was mostly built. Freya kept the sun and the moon. Loki came back some time later, leading a grey, eight-legged foal that he gave to Odin. The foal was Sleipnir, who became the greatest horse in the 9 worlds. The circumstances of his existence were not discussed in polite company. The deal was resolved. The gods had nearly lost everything because of an arrangement Loki had pushed them toward, and Loki's solution had required a transformation that showed everyone something about the depth of his shape changing, about how far into otherness he could go and come back from. The distance between Loki and the things Loki became was not as large as everyone had assumed. He was something that could become many things. That was useful. It was also a description of something with no fixed form, no core that was non-negotiable. What held Loki to the Asgard side of the boundary between order and chaos was not his nature. His nature was fluid and would flow where it found the lowest ground. What held him was his relationships. His blood brotherhood with Odin. His history with Thor. The specific bonds that gave the fluid thing a shape it chose to maintain. Those bonds were under pressure that only Loki could fully feel, because Loki saw everything. That was the nature of the thing he was. He saw the hypocrisy in the gods alongside their genuine courage. He saw the places where the arrangement that had been made of the world was more performance than reality. He saw the prophecy of Ragnarok sitting at the end of every road, and he saw every god walking those roads as though the destination was not already determined. And he kept being asked to fix the problems, keep the balance, repair the damage, maintain the structure, be useful to a system he could see was failing, for the benefit of beings who could not or would not see it as clearly as he did. The fixing was getting less satisfying. The problems were getting larger, and underneath both of those things, growing slowly, was something that did not yet have a name, but that was moving in a direction. There came an evening in a hall, a gathering of the gods, the kind of celebration that powerful people have when they want to remind themselves they are powerful. Loki arrived uninvited. He sat down, and then he began to speak. What followed is preserved in the sources as Lokasena, Loki's flighting, and it is one of the most uncomfortable documents in Norse mythology because of how true it is. He went around the hall, God be God, and said the worst true thing about each one. The affairs, the cowardices, the gaps between reputation and record. He named them all, precisely, patiently, without apparent purpose, except the saying of the things that were accurate, but that the arrangement of the gods required remain unspoken. He was not wrong about any of it. That is the part that stays with you. Every accusation landed because every accusation was true. Thor arrived and told him to stop. Loki said one more thing. Thor raised Mjolnir. Loki left. What that moment revealed was not new information about Loki's character. His character had always contained this. What it revealed was that the containing mechanism, the relationships, and the bonds, and the belonging that had given the fluid thing a shape it chose to maintain, was losing its hold. He had stopped fixing what he broke. He had started breaking things for the breaking itself. Thor stood in the hall after Loki left, with the hammer in his hand and the specific quiet of someone who has just watched something become irreversible without quite being able to identify the exact moment it happened. He had traveled with Loki for a very long time. He had navigated situations where Loki's way of seeing the world was the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one. He had tolerated the provocations and accepted the fixes and kept running the calculation that said the friendship was worth the cost. The calculation had just changed. Not because of anything specific that had been said in the hall, because of the specific quality of how it had been said. The difference between someone who breaks things and then repairs them and someone who breaks things because the breaking is its own destination. The companion who made everything more dangerous had arrived at a place beyond which the danger was no longer incidental. The road ahead of Thor was going to be walked without the shape changer beside him. He did not know yet exactly what that meant. He would find out in stages, each one worse than the one before, until the worst of what Loki was capable of arrived in a meadow in Asgard on an ordinary afternoon, and the world went quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before. Some losses you can see coming. They build themselves in stages, each stage a preparation for the next. And by the time the final stage arrives, you have been readied by everything that came before it. The hurt is real, but it has a shape. Your hands know how to hold. Then there are the other kind. Baldr was the son of Odin and Frigg. Every account that mentions him agrees on what he was the best thing in Asgard. Not the most powerful, not the most important to the cosmic order, but the best in the sense that the word carries when you use it about a person. He was warm the way early summer is warm, fully present, the kind of person who made everyone around him feel that the world was worth the trouble of being in it. He was kind without the performance of kindness, which is the rarest kind. He started having dreams about his death. The dreams were precise and insistent in the way that the Norse tradition recognized as prophetic. Not ordinary sleep chaos, but organized, detailed, arriving with the quality of information rather than imagination. Frigg received the news that her son had been dreaming of his own death and did what mothers do when they receive that information. She moved against it. She went out into the 9 worlds and asked everything in them to swear an oath that it would not harm Baldr. Every animal, every plant, every stone, every metal, every disease, every poison, every fire, every water. She went to everything and everything swore. The result was one of the strangest phenomena in the Norse tradition. Baldr became invulnerable. The gods tested it, because the gods could not resist testing it. And the testing became a game, a demonstration of something extraordinary happening in the middle of ordinary time. They threw things at Baldr and watched the things stop or deflect or fall harmlessly away. Ashes, arrows, stones, swords, all of it just stopped. None of it touched him. It became a celebration. The gods of Asgard gathered in a meadow and threw things at Baldr and laughed when the things fell short. Laughed at the proof of it, at the evidence that something in their world had been made safe. Genuinely and completely safe, in a tradition that had never before offered that kind of safety to anything. Thor was there. He threw things with the others. He watched the axes fall away. He heard the laughter. Loki watched too. He moved through the crowd with the observational quality he brought to every situation, seeing what others were not seeing, looking for the angle that the celebration was too loud to hear. And he found it. He went to Frigg in disguise, wearing the face of an old woman, and asked her a question wrapped in admiration. Had she really managed to get every single thing to swear? Had anything been missed? Anything too small or too young or too inconsequential to bother with? Frigg mentioned the mistletoe. It was young, she said. Too young to swear an oath. Too small to matter. A plant that grew on oak trees and had no real power of its own. She had not asked it. Loki went and found the mistletoe. He shaped it into a dart. He found Baldr's brother Hodr standing at the edge of the celebration, unable to participate because Hodr was blind. Loki offered to guide his hand. He placed the dart. He aimed. He told Hodr to throw. Hodr threw. Loki guided. The dart, made of mistletoe, struck Baldr, and Baldr fell, and the celebration stopped. What the sources try to convey in that moment, and cannot fully convey, is the quality of the silence that followed. It was not the silence of a crowd absorbing shocking news. It was something prior to that. Something that preceded the processing of what had happened. The specific silence of a world that had been one thing a moment ago and was now another thing, and had not yet developed language for the distance between them. Thor did not raise the hammer. That detail is worth holding. In every situation Thor had ever faced, there was something to face, a direction the problem was coming from, a thing to apply force to, a line between the problem and the solution that ran through whatever he was carrying. The entire architecture of his existence was built around the idea that when something was wrong, you went to where it was wrong, and you dealt with it. There was nothing to go toward, nothing to strike. Baldr was dead because a blind god had thrown something he did not know was dangerous, guided by a hand that had known exactly what it was doing. And the hand was somewhere in the 9 worlds, wearing some other face. And even if Thor found that hand, even if he found Loki and did what he was capable of doing, Baldr would still be in the same place. He did not raise the hammer. That may be the most important thing he did in that meadow. He stood in a situation that his entire nature had not prepared him for, and he held still inside it rather than reaching for the answer he always reached for when it was available. The gods sent a messenger to Hel, the realm of the dead, to ask whether Baldr could be returned. The ruler of that realm offered a condition. Everything in the 9 worlds had to weep for Baldr. Every stone, every tree, every animal, every being, the whole of creation expressing grief simultaneously, and she would release him. The whole world wept. The sources describe it. Stone wept. Metal wept. The trees wept. The gods wept. All of creation moved by the same loss at the same time. The grief real enough to pull tears from things that had no equipment for tears. In a cave, a giantess named Thok refused. She said that Baldr had never done anything for her. Let Hel keep what she had. The condition was not met. Baldr stayed in Hel. Thok was Loki. The sources state this not as suspicion but as fact. The hands that had guided the dart had also worn the giantess's face and said the words that closed the door on the one chance the world had to undo what had been done. The deliberateness of this is what changes everything. Everything before. The hair and the wall and the builder and the escalating provocations could be contained within some frame, however strained, of chaos that was not entirely purposeful. A trickster causing problems and fixing them, operating in the space between order and disorder without fully committing to either side. This was a commitment. Loki had decided something. He had weighed the arrangement, the world the gods had built, and the place it had made for him, and the cost of remaining in it. And he had decided. The sources do not give him a speech explaining himself. The actions explain themselves. In the meadow, Thor stood with a hammer that could not bring back the best thing that had lived there. He had driven back giants at the borders of Midgard for as long as he could remember. He had been to the edge of the world, and held the fishing line while the world serpent pulled at the other end. He had walked into Gearod's hall without his equipment and come out, having dealt with what needed dealing with. All of that was still true. The hammer still worked. The strength was still there. The boundary still needed tending, and he would still tend it. But something had gone out of the light in Asgard. Something that had made the world worth protecting had been taken out of it. Deliberately. By the companion who had been at Thor's side for longer than most things in the 9 worlds had existed. The game of throwing things at Baldr and watching them fall away, harmless. The celebration of something being genuinely safe, in a world that offered safety to almost nothing. That game would not be played again. The afternoon in the meadow had been the last of something. Thor knew it. Every god in Asgard knew it. The world was still there. The farms were still there. The fires in the longhouses were still burning. But the light was different now, and the being who had changed it was somewhere in the 9 worlds, wearing a face that was not his, having just done the one thing that could not be undone, waiting for whatever came next. The gods found Loki in a river. He had been running since Baldr's death, moving through the 9 worlds in shapes that left no trace, becoming fish, becoming shadow, becoming the kind of thing that passes through a space without evidence of having been there. He had built himself a house in a mountain with 4 doors, one facing each direction, so he could see what was coming from anywhere. He had been a salmon in the waterfall beneath the house, lying still in the current, with the patience of something that has decided stillness is the only viable remaining strategy. Odin found him from the high seat, the seat from which the All-Father could see all 9 worlds if he chose to look, the seat that cost him something every time he sat in it, because vision at that scale is never free. He looked. He found him. They came for Loki. Thor was among them. Loki ran. He became the salmon and moved upstream the way salmon move, with the specific power of a creature that navigates against the current as its natural mode of travel. Thor reached into the water and caught him. The sources describe this with the brevity they bring to physical actions Thor takes. He caught the salmon. He held on when it struggled. He gripped harder toward the tail, which is why, the mythology explains, salmon narrow at the tail the way they do. They brought him to a cave. What happened in that cave is described in the sources with a plainness that does not soften what it is describing. They used the entrails of Loki's own son Narfi, killed for this purpose, twisted into rope that hardened to iron. They bound him across 3 stones, one under his shoulders, one under his hips, one under his knees, so that he could not move and could not change shape and could not be anything other than exactly what he was. A serpent was placed above him, positioned to drip venom onto his face. His wife Sigyn stayed. She held a bowl beneath the serpent to catch the venom before it fell on him. She held it for as long as a bowl can be held, and when it was full, she turned to empty it. And in the time it took her to turn and empty and return, the venom fell on Loki's face. His body convulsed against the iron ropes. The ground above the cave shook. The Norse understood earthquakes as the record of those moments, the earth registering what was happening underneath it. Sigyn came back. She held the bowl again. This is where Loki stayed until Ragnarok. Now here is the question the mythology raises and does not answer cleanly. Was this justice? The logic had a shape to it. Baldr was dead. The rescue had been prevented. Something irreplaceable had been destroyed by an act of deliberate, calculated harm, and the being who had done it was now bound in a cave, in conditions designed to ensure that every moment of that binding was also an exercise in suffering, cause and consequence, action and response. And yet, the punishment was designed with a precision that went beyond restraint. The use of his son's body to make the chains, the serpent placed not to kill, but to ensure that the condition of imprisonment was also the condition of ongoing, unrelenting pain, the presence of Sigyn with her bowl, the mercy inside the punishment, which was itself a kind of cruelty, because it meant the mercy was also finite, that the bowl filled and had to be emptied, and in the emptying, the thing the mercy was preventing happened anyway. This was not restraint. This was engineering. The assembled gods of Asgard, who had spent considerable time weeping for the loss of the gentlest and most beloved among them, had constructed this with care. The capacity for that grief and the capacity for this punishment lived in the same beings at the same moment. The Norse tradition looks at that directly and does not look away. Thor was there for the binding. The sources do not give him a speech about it. No agonizing, no weighing, no visible processing of the rightness or wrongness of the thing. He was part of the group that caught Loki, and he was part of the group that brought him to the cave, and he stood there while the chains were set. What he felt is not recorded. The sources that are generally very willing to describe Thor's emotional states, his anger, his appetite, his satisfaction when a thing is done, go quiet here. That silence is not the silence of a narrator who did not think to ask. It is the silence of something that did not have the language available to it that the moment required. He had traveled with Loki longer than most things in the 9 worlds had existed. He had sat at fires with him and eaten with him and navigated situations where Loki's particular way of seeing the world was the difference between coming home and not coming home. He had tolerated the provocations and accepted the fixes and kept running the calculation that the friendship was worth the cost. The cost, at the end of the accounting, was Baldr. The cost was the world becoming less than it was. The cost was Frigg's face, and Hoja, who had thrown the dart without knowing what he was throwing, and the cave where Thok had sat and refused to weep when the whole world wept. Thor stood in the cave where the chains had been set. He did not speak. He looked at what had been done. He walked out into the light. But here is what the mythology does not say, and what the space between the lines makes clear. The door that closed in that cave was not just the door on Loki. It was the door on a way of moving through the world that Thor had used for a very long time. Loki had been the other approach, the flexible one, the one that could go where force could not go and see what straightforwardness could not see. That approach was in a cave now, bound to 3 stones, with Sigyn holding a bowl above it. Thor's road was narrower after that day, not weaker, narrower. The boundary still needed tending. The giants were still at the edges. The hammer still worked, and the strength was still there, and the work was still the work. He walked out of the cave and back into the light and picked up the hammer. He kept walking. Below the mountain, in the dark, Sigyn held the bowl. The serpent dripped. The ground above them shook in the moments the bowl was being emptied. And the world felt those moments in the way the world feels, things that happen in its deep places. As a tremor, as a brief instability in the ground that people standing on it interpreted in various ways. Thor walked through those tremors and kept his balance. He had been keeping his balance on unsteady ground for a very long time. His feet knew what to do when the ground moved. He adjusted. He kept walking. The road was in front of him. The boundary still needed tending. And somewhere in the dark, in the cave, the being who had been beside him on the road for so long was lying bound to 3 stones. And the question of what he would become after enough time in that dark, of what he would bring with him when the chains finally broke, was a question that had no answer yet. The answer was coming. Thor picked up the hammer. He walked out the door. It started as a winter that lasted longer than it should have. Not dramatically longer. Not so different in its first weeks that anyone could point to a day and say that is when it changed. The cold held past the point where cold usually released its hold. The light was going at a different pace. The signs that Norse farmers read to understand where they were in the year, the length of shadows at midday, the behavior of animals, the quality of air off the water, Those signs were saying something that everyone was reluctant to believe. Spring did not come. The season that should have followed winter did not arrive. The cold held. The snow stayed in the months when it should have been going. The livestock ran through the stored feed faster than the stores could support. People adjusted. The Norse were not strangers to hard winters. They had been navigating the edge of survival in the northern latitudes for generations, and they had developed an extremely accurate understanding of what a hard winter looked like and how to get through it. They drew on those skills. They rationed. They made the painful decisions about livestock that hard seasons required. They held together. The second winter came without a summer between them. This was when the understanding arrived. Not all at once. Not the same way in every person, but with the quality of a thing that cannot be explained by any of the available explanations. There had been hard winters before. There had not been 2 consecutive winters without a summer. Not in anyone's living memory. Not in any record that living memory could reach. The animals knew before the people did. The wolves at the edges of human settlement began moving differently. Not toward the settlements yet, but in patterns that the people who watched such things recognized as the behavior of animals that were no longer assuming there would be enough. The third winter came, and the second had not ended. The Norse tradition had a name for this. It had been in the prophecies for as long as the prophecies had been recorded. Sitting at the beginning of the sequence of events that ended with the gods dying and the world burning and the sea swallowing what remained. Fimbulwinter, the great winter, the first act of Ragnarok. Thor had known it was coming. He had known it the way he knew everything about his fate, which was fully and without flinching and without allowing the knowing to become the reason for stopping. He had known it since Hymir's lake. He had known it since Utgard. He had known it since the day the Norse tradition first recorded the prophecy and put his name in it next to the serpent's. He had gone out every morning and picked up the hammer anyway. He had done the work of the boundary, the maintenance of the world's edges, knowing that the edges were going to fail eventually and doing the maintenance regardless, because the knowing did not change what needed doing today. Now today had changed. He stood in the middle of the third winter and faced the thing he had no answer for. There were no giants to fight. That is the strange and disorienting quality of Fimbulwinter as the beginning of the end. The enemy was the condition itself. The cold and the dark and the slow dissolution of the bonds between people that the Norse tradition had always held as foundational. Families that had held together through the first winter and the second broke in the third. Brothers who had worked the same land their whole lives found themselves on opposite sides of their own desperation. Communities that had been cohesive in their management of shortage frayed under 3 years of a shortage that was not resolving. Thor could not strike the cold. He could not cross the distance to where the winter lived and deal with it. He could not find the lair of the darkness that was eating the light. He stood in the middle of the world he had spent his existence protecting, and the world was turning to ice around him, and there was nothing to point Mjolnir at. This was a different kind of impossible from anything he had faced before. At Utgard, the impossible had been disguised as possible, and the revelation of the gap between them had been managed by a clever king who made sure Thor never faced the real version of what he was being tested against. At Hymir's lake, the impossible had been the weight on the line, and he had held it until Hymir's hands made the decision. In both of those cases, there was still something to hold, something to push against, something that occupied the space between his hands and the problem. Fimbulwinter put nothing in that space. The sun was going wrong. The light it gave was the same light, but it was carrying less of what light is supposed to carry, as though the mechanism behind it was losing the thing that made it more than illumination. The sources describe it as the sun being weakened. Its warmth diminished. The sky above Midgard, providing light without the heat that the growing season required. Yggdrasil was shaking. The great ash tree, the axis around which all 9 worlds were organized, was moving in a way it had not moved before. The roots that had been gnawed since the beginning were giving way. The tree that had always been damaged and always been tended was reaching the point where the tending was no longer keeping pace with the damage. Thor stood in the third winter, with Mjolnir in his hand. Not passively, not with the stillness of someone who has given up, with the stillness of someone who knows what is coming and has already decided what he is going to do when it arrives. The moment for moving was not yet here. He could feel the shape of when it would be here. He had been doing this long enough to know the difference between the wait before the thing and the thing itself. The cold was a condition he could not fight. What came, when the cold broke, was the thing he had been built for. He waited. The wolves came closer to the settlements in the third year. The ordinary wolves, the ones that had lived at the edges of human territory for generations, in an arrangement of mutual wariness that both sides understood. Abandoned that arrangement. They moved toward the places where humans were, because humans were what was left. The bonds between people continued to break. The structure of what the Norse tradition called civilization, the arrangement of obligations and loyalties, and the mutual recognition that the people around you were people, came under a pressure it had not been designed to survive. It survived in places. It failed in others. The surviving and the failing were not distributed according to any pattern that rewarded virtue or punished its absence. They were distributed the way things are distributed when the underlying conditions have become incompatible with the things being sustained. Thor watched this. He could not stop it. The boundary between order and entropy that he had spent his existence maintaining was not a boundary you could hold with a hammer when the entropy was already inside the boundary. He waited. The winter held. He held. And in the dark beneath a mountain somewhere, in a cave where Sigyn held a bowl and the serpent dripped and the ground shook in the moments the bowl was being emptied, something was waiting too. The chains were very old now. The iron that had been the entrails of a sun was very old, and the weight against it had been continuous, and the cold of Fimbulwinter had done to the metal what cold does to metal over time, which is to make it more brittle, more susceptible to the kind of force that sustained pressure eventually becomes. Loki had been in that cave with nothing to do but think. 3 years without summer is a very long time to think. Thor stood in the cold and waited for the winter to end. He knew it would not end into spring. He knew what it would end into. He waited anyway. The hammer was in his hand. The work that was coming was the work the hammer was made for. The work he had been made for. The thing that had been in the water at Hymir's lake, looking up through the surface with eyes full of recognition, was below the sea somewhere, and the sea above it was rising with the weight of what was about to happen. The third winter held, and then, between one moment and the next, it broke. The winter ended the way the prophecy said it would, not with the slow warming that turns snow to water and water to mud and mud to the first uncertain green of a new season, not with lengthening days and returning birds and the particular quality of morning light when the angle of the sun has shifted enough to mean something, not with any of the signs the Norse farmers had read for generations to know that the world was turning back toward life. It ended with noise. Heimdall blew the Gjallar horn. The sound of it crossed all 9 worlds simultaneously, the way only one sound in the history of the Norse tradition was ever described as crossing all 9 worlds simultaneously, because only one sound had ever needed to. It was the signal that had been reserved since the beginning for the one moment that made every other moment look like preparation. Every being in every world who heard it understood what it meant, not because they had been told, because some knowledge lives below the level of telling. In the place where the body knows things, the mind has not yet processed. Fenrir broke his chain. The wolf that had been bound since the gods recognized what he was becoming, bound with a ribbon made from things that do not exist, from the sound of a cat's footstep and the beard of a woman and the roots of a mountain. That binding gave way in the final winter the way things give way when they have been under sufficient pressure for sufficient time. Fenrir opened his jaw, and the sources describe it spanning from the earth to the sky. Everything between those 2 points was in the space of that jaw, in a cave beneath a mountain. Iron that had been entrails, that had been Nafi, that had held for longer than the binding of Fenrir, broke. Loki came out of the ground with everything he had accumulated in the dark. Years of pain and immobility and the specific quality of thought that comes to a mind with nothing to do but think. He came out knowing exactly what he was going to do with all of it. The sea rose. Jormungandr had been at the bottom of it since Hymir's lake. Since the fishing line had gone taut and the surface had broken, and the eyes had looked up and recognized what was looking down. It had been in the deep water through all the seasons of Fimbulwinter, through Baldr's death and the binding and the long cold, coiled in the dark with the patience of something that lives without light. When it moved, the sea moved with it. The water displaced by the serpent's rising reached the coastlines of Midgard in volumes that had no meteorological explanation. The harbors that had boats in them stopped having boats in them. The coastlines that people had built their lives around changed their shape. The sea was doing something it had not done before. Something that had been coming since before the world had a name for what coming meant. Jormungandr rose into the air above the water. It rose to a height that only something the size of the world could rise to. A height that was not a measurement, but a presence. Something that had been below the world's surface since the beginning, now above it, filling a portion of the sky that the sky had never been asked to share before. It breathed, and what it breathed was poison. Not directed, not aimed. Simply the atmosphere of the thing expressed at full scale in a world that had no remaining reason to contain it. Thor felt it before he saw it. Not the way you feel, a threat you have to locate and identify. The way you feel something you have been waiting for. The specific quality of the air when something very large is moving through it, combined with the specific quality of recognition that had been sitting in his body since the day at Hymir's lake, when he had stood in a boat with a hole in its hull and looked into eyes that knew him. The fishing line was no longer in anyone's hands. Hymir was not in this boat. There was no knife available to cut anything. This was the version of the meeting that the other version had been a preview of. Thor picked up Mjolnir. The deliberateness of it matters, not the reactive grab of someone surprised by something they did not expect. The deliberateness of someone who has known this moment was coming for a very long time and has been holding still until the moment for moving arrived, and the moment for moving is now. He walked toward the sound of the serpent. The plain of Vigrid was described in the Norse sources as large enough to hold every army that had ever existed, a space that seemed prepared for exactly this purpose. The gods came to it. The warriors from Valhalla, gathered by Odin across the long years of preparation, came to it. Freya came without his sword, which he had given away in a different chapter of the mythology and would not have at the moment he needed it most. Odin came on Sleipnir with his spear. The armies of the living and the dead moved across the plain in the noise and chaos that the sources try to describe and that exceeds what description can contain. Thor moved through all of it toward Jormungandr. The distance between them closed, the way the sources describe it, which is to say, it closed with the quality of the inevitable. The feeling that the closing had been happening since the world was made, and this was only the final increment. The last small distance in a journey that had begun long before either of them had names. The serpent's atmosphere reached him before the serpent did. The poison that was its breath, not aimed, not deployed as a weapon. Simply present the way. The atmosphere of something very large is present when you are inside it. Thor breathed it. He breathed it the way you breathe what is in the air when there is no other air. It entered him and began the work that the Hydra's blood began when it touched something. The slow and patient work that did not stop until it had gone all the way through. He kept walking. The eyes of Jormungandr, when he reached them, were the same eyes that had looked up through the surface of the water at Hymir's lake. The recognition in them was the same recognition. You are the thing I end. You are the thing that ends me. This is the moment we have both been pointed at since before the world had names for moments. Thor raised Mjolnir, not in the way of someone deciding to act, in the way of someone completing an action that began a very long time ago and has been in motion ever since, and has now reached the point where the motion arrives at its destination. He swung. The sound of the blow was not like other sounds Mjolnir had made. Every other time the hammer had struck something, the sound had been contained within the specific event, specific location, specific consequence. This sound was different. It was the sound the mythology had been building toward since the first time thunder rolled across the Norse sky, and a farmer looked up and felt what the farmer felt. It was the sound of the thing the hammer was made for meeting the thing the hammer had been made to meet. Jormungandr died, the serpent that had encircled Midgard since before Midgard had a name, that had held its own tail in its mouth, and in doing so defined the boundary between the organized world and the ocean beyond it, that had looked up through the water at Hymir's lake and recognized what was coming for it, came down. The coil that had enclosed the world uncoiled, the tail released. The shape of the world, which had always been partly the shape of the serpent that enclosed it, began the process of becoming something whose shape was not yet determined. Thor stood over what he had done. The hammer was still in his hand, the handle that was too short, that Loki's bite on a dwarf's eyelid had made shorter than it was supposed to be, was in his grip, the way it had been in his grip since the day Brokkr and Sindri handed it over. He had not let it go. The battlefield of Vigrid was still happening around him, still producing its catastrophic noise in every direction. But it was at a distance now, the distance that important things sometimes move to when the most important thing has just occurred. He had done it. The thing the prophecy had named him for. The thing that had been the destination of every road he had ever walked, every boundary defended, and every morning he had picked up the hammer, when picking it up required more than he had thought he had. He had done it. He took a step. 2. The battlefield was around him, the sound of it, the armies and the fire and the collapse of the world's structure happening in every direction simultaneously, was real and present, and at the same time completely peripheral. The way everything becomes peripheral when the body is doing its own accounting, and the accounting requires full attention. 3. The poison of Jormungandr had been in his lungs since before he swung the hammer. It was in his blood now, doing the patient and inevitable work that the Hydra's blood did when it found its way into something. The work that did not rush, because it had no reason to rush, because it would arrive at its destination regardless of what anything did in the interval. He could feel it. He had the specific intelligence of someone who had been in enough situations to know what he was feeling when he felt it. He kept walking. 4. 9 steps. The sources give us this number with the same plainness they bring to most things, as though 9 is simply the number, and the number is simply the fact, and the fact requires no elaboration. But 9 was not an arbitrary number in the Norse tradition. 9 was the number of completion. Odin hung from Yggdrasil for 9 days. There were 9 worlds on the tree. 9 was the number that meant a full measure of something had been expressed, a full cycle run, a thing done completely, from beginning to end. 5. The 5th step was still Thor. The poison was working, and the battlefield was ending, and the world was in the process of becoming something other than what it had been. And the 5th step was taken by the same being who had taken the 1st step, and the same being who had picked up the hammer in the hall of Bilskirnir on every morning of an existence that stretched back further than most things in the 9 worlds. The 5th step was still the god who had stood at the edges of the world and done the work that kept the middle from dissolving. Still the sun of the sky and the earth. Still the thunder between them. Still the being whose name the Norse farmer heard in the sound that came from the west and felt what he felt when he heard it. The 5th step was still Thor. 6. He was not thinking about Ragnarok in these steps. He was not thinking about the prophecy, or the question of what came after, or the shape of whatever the world was becoming around him. He was thinking about nothing. Or he was thinking about everything at once, which in the body's experience amounts to the same thing. He was present to the steps themselves, one foot and then the other, the ground beneath the boots, the weight of the hammer in his hand, which he had still not released. He had not let go of the hammer. 7. Think about what that detail means. His body was running the accounting that a body runs when the poison of the world serpent is doing what that poison does. And he had not released the hammer. Not because he was planning to use it again. There was nothing left to use it on. He had not released it because releasing it would have been a decision, and the decision would have required acknowledging what the body was already acknowledging. And something in him was not prepared to make that decision yet. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe he held it because it was his, and he had held it for the whole of his existence, and the habit of holding it was deep enough to outlast the physical capacity to use it. 8. One step left. He had done the arithmetic at some point. The arithmetic that 8 steps makes available. And there was one step left, and the sources record nothing about what that knowledge felt like from the inside. They record the number. They record the falling. The inside of that moment is the space that the Norse tradition leaves for the person hearing the story to fill with whatever they themselves understand about standing at the end of something that was always going to end this way. He had known it at Hymir's lake. He had looked into the eyes that looked back up through the water, and he had understood, in the specific, non-intellectual way that bodies understand certain things, what the last day of his existence was going to feel like. He had carried that knowledge for every morning between that lake and this plain. He had carried it to Bilskirnir and back out again. He had carried it through Fimbulwinter. He had carried it into the rising poison of the serpent's breath and through the swing and into these steps. The knowing had not stopped him. The knowing had never been the kind of thing that stopped him. He was not built for stopping when the work was in front of him. And the work had always been in front of him. And on the last day of his existence, the work had been the thing he was built for. The specific work that no one else in the 9 worlds had been made to do. 9. He fell on the 9th step. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of fall that announces itself to the battlefield around it. He went down the way things go down when the mechanism that was holding them up has given everything it had to give, and the giving is complete. The hammer hit the ground beside him. The handle that had always been too short. The handle that Loki's bite on a dwarf's eyelid had made shorter than the craftsman intended. Struck the earth of Vigrid and was still. The battle continued around him. The armies and the fire and the ending of the world proceeded in every direction. The world was concluding in all the ways the prophecy had specified, and the conclusion was thorough and did not pause for any part of itself. But on this small piece of the plain, the thunder was quiet. 9 steps. Stand up wherever you are and take 9 steps and look back at where you started. That is the distance. That is the gap between the completion of the thing Thor was made to do and the moment the doing of it ended him. Not very far. Far enough to know the serpent was behind him. Not far enough to be anywhere new. 9 steps is the distance the Norse tradition decided to place between victory and its price. The number is not incidental. 9 steps to complete the cycle. 9 steps to run the full measure, from beginning to end. 9 steps to do the thing completely, and then have the completeness arrive at what completeness costs. In Bilskirnir, the hall that was the largest building in the 9 worlds. There was a fire in the right position, and a door that fit. There were 2 boys named Strength and Courage, who had grown up watching their father leave and watching him come back. They had understood something in the watching that had never been explicitly taught. The leaving was the other side of the love. The hammer was the reason the home existed. The work and the belonging were the same thing expressed in 2 directions. Magni and Modi were on the plain of Vigrid. They were going to walk across it when the walking was possible, and they were going to find what their father had left on the ground, and they were going to pick it up, not as inheritance, not as memorial, as the continuation of what the hammer had always been, which was the work that did not end when the worker ended, the responsibility that passed from hand to hand, and generation to generation, and world to world. The hammer was on the ground of Vigrid. It was not going to stay there. Thor had not stopped the end of the world. The end of the world was proceeding in every direction across the plain of Vigrid, and he had not stopped it, and no one had expected him to stop it. That was never the work. The work was never stopping the end. The work was the boundary maintained for one more season. The farm that continued to exist. The child who survived the winter. The boats that went out and came back. All the quiet winds that left no monuments and required no celebration, and simply kept the middle from dissolving, for as long as the middle could be kept. The work was standing at the edge of the world and making the darkness fight through you before it got to everything else. He had done that. For every morning of an existence that the sources record in fragments, and that stretched in the spaces between those fragments into something very long and very full, and very much the shape of the question, it had always been organized around, what does a god do when the world he was born to protect is already doomed? He picks up the hammer. He walks out the door. He takes 9 steps, and the hammer does not stay on the ground. The sea came back first, not the sea that had risen with the serpent, not the displaced and chaotic water of Ragnarok pushing against coastlines that had not been built to receive it. A different sea, one that arrived the way things arrive after the conclusion of something enormous, quietly, without announcement, filling the space that the conclusion had left behind. It was cold, and it was clean, and it moved in the patterns that water moves in when there is nothing disturbing it from below. The earth followed, not the old earth, not the ground that had been made from Ymir's body at the beginning of everything. Earth that came up from somewhere underneath the catastrophe, pushed upward by whatever exists beneath the layer that the dragon had been gnawing at. The bedrock that had been there since before the tree, and the 9 worlds, and the names that had been given to all of it. It came up green. The sources that describe this new world reach for a specific quality of green, not the deep-layered green of forests that have been growing for 1,000 years, the green of the very first spring, the green that is also slightly yellow at its edges because it has not yet committed entirely to one or the other, the green that is the earth's first answer to light after a long darkness. Grain appeared without being planted. The sources state this plainly, without apology for the strangeness of it, because in the first moments of a new world, the distinction between wild and cultivated had not yet been established, and the world was offering its first provision before anyone had thought to ask for it. Someone would learn where to plant and when and how much, and the knowledge would become skill, and the skill would become tradition. But first there was the grain. The world, opening its hand before the people in it, had learned to ask. Some of the gods survived. Not all, not most, but some came to a place that had been called Idavol, the plains where Asgard had stood, and they sat in the new grass, and they talked. They found, pressed into the soil around them, the golden game pieces the gods had used to play board games in the old world, small discs of gold, half buried in the new growth. They picked them up and held them. The holding of them was the holding of evidence, proof that what had existed before the final winter and the battle on Vigrid had been real, that it was history now, a specific collection of things that had happened and mattered, rather than a dream that the morning had ended. Among those who came to Idavol were 2 young men, Mjolnir, Modi, the sons of Thor, carrying the names their father had given them, names that had announced from the beginning what the world was going to require. They were alive because the prophecy had said they would be alive, and the prophecy had said they would be alive because the tradition understood that what they carried needed to be carried forward. Not their father, Their father had been spent on the plane of Vigrid in the specific way that things are spent when they give everything they have to the purpose they were made for. The giving was complete. What remained of Thor was what always remains when something has been fully expressed. Not the thing itself, but the shape it made in the world. The ongoing consequence of what it did and what it was. What Magni and Modi carried was Mjolnir. The sources tell us this simply. After Ragnarok, in the new world, rising from the sea, Magni and Modi had the hammer. The transmission happened without ceremony in the telling, because the act itself did not require ceremony. It required the recognition that the hammer was there, and the work was not finished, and they were the ones who were there. Magni had lifted the leg of the dead giant Hrungnir off his father's chest when he was 3 years old. No assembled god of Asgard had been able to move it. The child had walked over and lifted it without visible effort. And Thor had looked up from the ground at his son and seen something he recognized immediately and given the boy the best horse in the hall, not as a gift, as an acknowledgement of a thing that deserved to be seen. He understood the weight of things. He had understood it before he had language for the understanding. The hammer in his hands at the edge of the new world was not a new weight. It was the continuation of a weight that had been in the family before he was born. The weight of the work that did not end when the worker ended. The responsibility of the boundary and the maintenance and the morning when you picked up the hammer and walked out the door, because that was what needed doing. Modi carried the anger. The clean, hot kind that was his father's. The kind that arrived fast and left fast, and was always honest about itself. The kind that was not a flaw, but a form of clarity. He was going to need it. The new world rising from the sea was green and young, and full of the specific vulnerability of things that have not yet developed their defenses. The forces that had pressed against the boundary between order and entropy in the old world were not creatures of the old world exclusively. Entropy was a property of the universe. The universe had been reset. Reset universes still had entropy in them. The work was still the work. They carried Mjolnir into the new world the way their father had carried it into every morning of the old one. As the tool it was, as the instrument of the responsibility it represented, as the thing that needed to be in the right hands if the right work was going to be done. The hammer that had been made in an act of craftsmanship interrupted by sabotage, whose handle was shorter than it should have been because a shape-changer had made a choice that could not be unmade, whose makers had been working against interference and had produced something extraordinary despite it. That hammer was in the new Midgard now, the one rising from the sea, the one whose grain was already growing without being planted. It had never failed. The people who were going to live in the new world were going to need what the people of the old world had needed. Rain at the right time. Grain that grew when the conditions were right. Summers that were not too short and not too brutal. Summers that gave the northern land enough of what it needed to survive the winter that would follow. They were going to need someone to stand at the edge of the inhabited world and do the work of the boundary. The maintenance of the arrangement between order and entropy that never ended, and never rewarded you for doing it, except by allowing the middle to hold for another season. They were going to need the thunder. It came. In the new world. Of course it came. The atmosphere of a world is the atmosphere of a world, which means it has the conditions that produce thunder. The differential between the charge in the cloud and the charge in the ground. The moment when the air cannot hold the difference and releases it in light and sound. Someone standing in a field, in the new world, turning the soil in preparation for the planting that would become the tradition, that would become the thing that was done because it had always been done. Heard it for the first time. The sound from the west, low and rolling, felt in the chest before it reached the ears. The person stopped. Something moved through them. Not a memory, because they had no memory of the old world and its long history. Not knowledge, something more like instinct. The recognition of a sound that meant something before anyone had told them what it meant. The recognition that lives in the body before it rises to the mind. There was someone out there, past the edge of the new field, past the edge of the new world's boundaries, in the direction the thunder came from. Something enormous was doing its job. They stood in the field under the new sky and listened to the thunder move from west to east across the new world. Then they went back to work. The hammer was in the right hands. The work was still the work. Every week, without thinking about it, you say his name, not in a prayer, not in a ritual, not in any act of conscious invocation or deliberate acknowledgement of what you are doing. You say it the way you say Monday or Wednesday, automatically, functionally, as information about where you are in the sequence of days. The answer to the question of what day it is: Thursday, Thor's day, named for a god who has been dead, in the terms of the tradition that made him. Since before the English language was a language, the name travels through every week of every year that the calendar keeps, quiet and regular and permanent. The people who named the day did not do it casually. The Germanic peoples who organized their week around the names of divine powers were building a cosmology into the rhythm of ordinary time, a way of moving through the days that kept the important things present at the level of language, which is the level where things are most durable. You can destroy a temple. You can suppress a tradition and replace it with something else. But if the word is already in the mouth of every person who needs to know what day it is, the word continues. Thursday continued. It continued through the conversion of the Germanic and Scandinavian peoples to Christianity, which involved, in several documented cases, the deliberate removal of the physical objects of the old tradition. Temples were taken down. The Mjolnir pendants that people had worn for generations were, in communities that had fully converted, replaced with the cross. Some people wore both for a while. The archaeological record from Viking Age sites includes examples of the hammer and the cross appearing together, sometimes in the same grave, sometimes on the same chain. People navigating between two systems with the same practical intelligence they brought to everything else, holding on to what worked, testing what was being offered. The hammer that had blessed marriages and hallowed newborns and sent the dead properly on their way, being held alongside the symbol of a tradition that also blessed and hallowed and attended to the dead. Thor survived in language because language is where the most honest record of what people actually needed is kept. The official tradition could change. The calendar did not change, because the calendar was too embedded in the practical organization of life to change without costs that exceeded the benefits. You need to know what day it is. The day kept his name. He survived in weather because weather is not a human institution and does not respond to the decisions of councils and authorities. The thunder that rolled across the North Sea in the 9th century was the same thunder that rolled across it in the 21st. The same differential between cloud and ground. The same release of accumulated charge in light and sound. The Norse farmers who heard it and felt the specific feeling, the relief of knowing someone was out there. They were not entirely wrong about the relationship between the sound and the being they associated with it. They had looked at a natural phenomenon and said it meant something. That kind of looking is not primitive. It is the beginning of every meaningful relationship humans have had with the world they live in. He survived in the texture of how people imagine a certain kind of person. The protector who asks for no recognition. The strength spent in ways that leave no monument. The one who shows up when the situation requires showing up and does not require that the showing up be acknowledged or celebrated or even noticed. The one who goes back out the next morning because the work is there and someone has to do it. Every tradition has people like this. Every time and place produces them. People whose work is necessary and invisible and who do not receive monuments, because monuments are for the notable dead, and the work these people do is too ongoing to be notable and too continuous to be dead. Thor was made for those people. He was given to them. They wore his hammer around their necks, not because he was going to save them from everything, but because he was evidence that the universe had taken seriously enough to the need for this kind of presence that it had made a god for the purpose. The version that arrived in 1962, in the pages of a comic book that became, across the following decades, one of the most recognizable figures in the world, with the blonde hair and the cape and the team of colorful people saving cities from threats that resolved within the duration of a film. That version is not wrong about Thor. It is a version of Thor. It is the current form of an impulse that has been producing new forms of the same essential figure for a very long time. Each form appropriate to its moment. Each form reaching the people of its moment through the language and the images and the concerns of that moment. What the current form does not carry is the weight of the original. The fishing line at the edge of Hymir's lake. The 9 steps on the plain of Vigrid. The hall in Thrudheim with the fire in the right position. Left behind every morning for the work that did not end. The hammer with the short handle, made in sabotage, that never failed. That weight is still in the sources. It is still in the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda that Snorri Sturluson wrote down in 13th century Iceland from a tradition already centuries old. A tradition he understood was being lost and that he preserved, even as the world he lived in had formally moved past it. He was writing down something the world was done with. The world was not done with it. People keep picking it up. The Norse revival of the 19th century found in the mythology a set of images that felt like the ones a certain moment in European history needed. The 20th century scholarship that treated the Eddas as serious literature and serious theology found that they rewarded the treatment. The people who come to the original sources after seeing the films and find something they did not expect. Something older and sadder and more honest than the version they were given. Something that knew how it was going to end and kept going anyway. That quality has kept the tradition alive through 1,000 years of being replaced and suppressed and transformed and adapted into nearly every form that human storytelling has available to it. The Norse farmers on the North Sea coast understood it when they heard the thunder and felt what they felt. The name Thursday carries it through every week, whether or not anyone thinks about what they are saying when they say it. Not the strength. The strength was always in the tradition and was never the most interesting thing about it. The continuation. The God who knew the world was going to end and walked out the door every morning anyway. The God who held the fishing line while the serpent pulled at the other end and did not let go until someone else cut it. The God who looked at the 9 steps between him and the ground and took them one at a time with Mjolnir still in his hand. There is a kind of courage that does not photograph well. It does not have a single image that captures it. A face set against a dramatic sky. It is the courage of the ordinary morning. The morning that is, like the morning before it, and the morning before that. The morning when you pick up the thing you picked up yesterday and go back to the place you went yesterday and do what needs doing today. The people who practice that courage are usually not aware they are practicing courage. They are aware that there is work, and they are the one who does it. Thor was built for those people, made from the sky and the earth for the people who work the boundary between what is ordered and what is not. Given a hammer that was not perfect, and a world that was going to end, and a fate that was going to cost him everything he had, he picked up the hammer. He walked out the door. Every Thursday. In the language of the people who needed him most. You say his name. You are not wrong to say it. You are participating in something very old. Something that has been running through the weeks of human time since before the language existed. Since before the people who speak it were a people. You are saying the name the farmers trusted when the thunder came and they went back to work. He was out there. He was always out there. 9 steps. That was all he had left at the end. 9 steps was enough. There is a farmer in a field. The field is wherever you need it to be. Norway, in the 9th century. The soil dark and resistant. The growing season short enough that every clear morning is a small gift. Iceland, in the 10th century. The settlers still learning what this new land would and would not give. Still negotiating with a sky they did not yet fully know. England, in the 11th century. In a village where the day of the week is called by a name, whose origin most people have already stopped thinking about. Or it is wherever you are. If you have ever stood somewhere doing the work that needs doing, the work that will need doing again tomorrow and the day after that, and looked up because there was a sound from outside the walls. The farmer is working. The work is the kind that does not finish, that generates its own continuation, that will ask the same attention tomorrow that it asked today. The farmer does not think of this as heroic. The farmer thinks of it as the condition of having a farm, which is the same as saying the condition of feeding people, which is the same as saying the condition of the world continuing to be the kind of world where people can be fed. The sky to the west has a quality this morning. The clouds are doing something at the edge of the horizon. The farmer reads them the way the farmer reads everything about this particular stretch of land and sky, through the accumulated knowledge of seasons and returns, through the specific intelligence that comes from paying close attention to the same things for a long time. There is weather coming. The question is, what kind? Then the sound, low and rolling, felt in the chest before it reaches the ears, moving from west to east across the sky with the unhurried weight of something that has been moving for a very long time and has a great deal of space left to cross. It does not rush. It has never needed to rush. It is the thunder, and the thunder moves at the pace of the thunder and has been doing so since before anyone was here to hear it. The farmer stops, not in fear, with the specific stillness of someone who has heard something they recognize and is taking a moment to acknowledge the recognition. The hands are quiet. The eyes are up. The body is in the posture of a person paying attention to something that deserves it. You know what this is now. You have spent the time between the beginning of this story and this moment in the company of everything the sound carries. The being who made it, or who was made from it, or who was the same thing as it expressed in a form that could walk and swing a hammer and come home to a hall in Thrudheim and eat an unreasonable amount and leave again the next morning. You know about the fishing line at the edge of the world. You know about the cat in the hall of Utgard that was the world's serpent, about the drinking horn connected to the sea, about what it meant that Thor came as close to drinking the sea dry as anything in the 9 worlds ever came. You know about Baldr in the meadow and the mistletoe, and the world going quiet in a way it had never gone quiet before. You know about Fimbulwinter and the 3 years without summer, and Thor standing in the cold with Mjolnir in his hand and nothing to point it at. You know about the 9 steps. The farmer does not know any of this. The farmer knows the sound. The farmer knows the feeling the sound produces. The feeling that has been produced by this sound in the people of the northern latitudes since before the calendar that carries Thursday was a calendar. The feeling is not intellectual. It is not a conclusion reached by reasoning. It is what the body does when it has been doing a thing for long enough that the doing is no longer voluntary. The body recognizes. The body trusts. The farmer looks up for the duration of the thunder, and then the thunder passes east, and the silence after it has the quality that silences have after large sounds. The quality of a space that has just been occupied by something and retains the shape of the occupancy for a moment before it closes back into ordinary air. The farmer goes back to work. This is the whole story. Not the 19 chapters and the prologue and the epilogue. Not the specific events that the sources preserved and the tradition carried forward through 1,000 years of transformation. This moment, the farmer in the field, and the sound from the west, and the recognition in the body, and the return to work. Because this is what Thor was for. The mythology was the container that carried the meaning through time. The specific form the meaning took in the specific culture that produced it. The meaning is older than the mythology. The meaning is in the sound itself, in the relationship between the sound and the people who heard it, in the thing the sound told them about the nature of the world they were living in. The world has edges that are not safe. It has always had edges that are not safe. It has forces at those edges that are not compatible with the human project of building something that lasts. The history of human civilization is the history of the ongoing negotiation with those forces, the daily maintenance of the boundary between what has been organized and what has not been organized yet. The work that is never finished and never rewarded except by the continuation of the thing it maintains. Someone has to do that work. The Norse tradition took that someone and gave him a name and a hammer and a red beard and a hall in Thrudheim and a wife with golden hair and 2 sons, named for what would be needed. They gave him a fate that cost him everything. They gave him a world that was going to end, regardless of what he did. They gave him the complete and certain knowledge of both of those things, and they gave him the morning anyway. The morning after the morning after the morning. He did not stop. He went out every morning of an existence that stretched from the beginning of the Norse tradition to the plain of Vigrid. Every morning the work was the same work. It had been the morning before. Every morning the hammer was the hammer with the short handle. Every morning the boundary still needed tending, and the giants were still at the edges, and the middle was worth protecting for exactly as long as it could be protected. He protected it. Not perfectly. Not without cost. Not without the losses that accumulate over a long existence spent doing difficult things in a world not arranged to reward the doing of them. He lost Baldr. He lost Loki to the cave, and then to Ragnarok. He lost the world itself. The specific world he had spent his existence maintaining. He lost it, and he protected it anyway. Right up to the 9 steps. The 9 steps are still there. They are still the right measure of what it costs to do the thing you were made to do. Fully. Without holding anything back. You finish. You take 9 steps. You fall. But the hammer does not stay on the ground. That is what the mythology understood that most endings do not understand. The hammer does not stay on the ground because it was never only about the person holding it. The person holding it was the expression of the work, the current form of a responsibility that is older than any individual expression of it, that passes from hand to hand and generation to generation and world to world. Magni picked it up. Modi stood beside him. The new world was green around them, and the sea was calm, and the sky above it had not yet produced its first thunder. It would. The farmer in the field is still standing there. The thunder has moved east, and the silence after it is the silence you are in now. At the end of this story, the farmer's hands are ready to go back to the work. The work is the work it has always been. Before the farmer moves, there is one more moment. In that moment, if you pay attention to it the way the farmer pays attention to weather, you can feel what the farmer felt. The recognition that is not intellectual, the trust that is not argued into existence but is simply there, in the body. The way the knowledge of your own particular stretch of land and sky is in the body of the person who has been working it for a long time. Someone is out there, past the edge of the field, past the edge of the map, past the boundary between what is organized and what is not yet organized. Someone is doing the work, not because they will be rewarded for it, not because it will prevent the eventual end of things, because it is the morning, and the hammer is in their hand, and the road is in front of them. And that is what you do when those 3 things are true. You pick up the hammer, you walk out the door, the thunder moves east and fades, and the sky after it is the sky it was before. And the farmer bends back to the work. And Thursday comes around again next week, and the week after that, and the week after that. The sound carries his name in it. It always did. It always will.